Hello everyone, welcome to another stream. So as you would have seen by the title, today I'm going to be responding to Michael from Inspiring Philosophy in his response to my response to some of his videos talking about the the philosophical implications of various results from cosmology and quantum mechanics mostly. So apologies if people have been waiting a little for the stream. I was just finishing my preparation. So anyway, I'm hoping this will not be too long, maybe an hour and a half, I'm thinking. Try to keep it, within reasonable time, but there are a few things to go through. So just for some context, Inspiring Philosophy has put up a number of videos over several years now talking about what he believes are the philosophical implications of various results from physics and science for his idealist or theistic idealist worldview. I've responded to some of those in a few different videos. And recently, Michael has written a blog post here on his blog in which he responds to this earlier video, Inspiring Philosophy versus Science, which I titled, I think, How Inspiring Philosophy Misrepresents Science. Now, first thing I need to comment on is the title of my video, because Michael and a number of his followers who seem to have been review bombing the original video a little bit, not too much, but there's quite a few more dislikes there now than there were originally. They seem to have been taking issue with my choice of the word misrepresent. So let me clarify there. I think I did say this a little bit at the end of my original video, but I'm going to make it clear right off the bat now. So when I say that Inspiring Philosophy misrepresents science, what I mean is I think that he gives an inaccurate, a wrong impression, a misleading impression of the science, right? Now, mislead can mean to give a deliberately wrong impression, or it can just mean to give a wrong impression, to give a misleading, inaccurate impression or account of something. And that's what I mean here. I don't mean to say that Michael is doing this deliberately. I think he's very earnest and sincere in what he's doing here. So nevertheless, I do think that he's very wrong about a lot of the implications that he's drawing from the sort of science that he's appealing to here. And so I stand by my use of that title, and I'm going to continue using it until such time as I no longer believe that he's misrepresenting the science. And I don't want it to I don't want it to appear here that this is intended in any sense of ill will. Michael here is saying that he thinks the title is not respectful. I mean, the title doesn't have anything to do with Michael as a person. It's all about his ideas. That is, that his ideas do not accurately represent the science. So I don't take that as anything to do with respect. It's, well, I guess you could say I'm not respecting the ideas, but ideas I don't think need to have respect. They're, right or wrong or accurate, inaccurate. So if he doesn't feel that the title respects him, I guess that's his issue there. But it's not a personal attack in any way. It's just a statement about the fact that I think his videos misrepresent the science. Let's see. So, oh yes, I wanted to say something about this as well. So I debated Michael a few weeks ago about the digital physics argument, and I agree that we had a good conversation and that there was mutual respect. I stand by that. I still do respect him. And I hope that we can have another discussion again in the future. It seems like that I've upset him with this title. Again, I don't see any connection between use of this title and my respect for him as a person. I have made this point in previous videos where I've discussed with Nathan and other people that I think he's misrepresenting the science. And I know that he watched some of those videos because he responded to them in part in the debate we had. So the point is, this is not a new claim. Ever since I've started watching his videos, I've made, and responding to them, I've made the claim that I believe Michael is misrepresenting many aspects of the science that he appeals to. And I'm going to continue to make that claim for as long as I believe that it is accurate. That has nothing to do with my attitude towards Michael as a person or my respect for him. All right, I hope that I've made myself clear there. So let us move on to the substance here. This blog post is basically a walk through all of the different aspects that I talked about. I want to respond to most of what is said here. There may be little bits that I skip past because I don't think they're super important, but we'll see how we go. So And I'm also not going to play back the previous video. I'll put a link to that so you can watch that if you would like. I will play a few segments of Michael's videos that I had responded to for extra context. But for the most part, I'm just going to be working through this blog post. All right. So the holographic principle. So the holographic principle is a principle in, I guess, theoretical physics, you could say, which states essentially that the information content of a volume can be contained entirely on the surface of that volume. We'll get a more precise definition when I bring up some references in a moment. It originally was developed to explain certain paradoxes with respect to black holes, which we didn't get into here. But anyway, so that's what we're talking about here. So this is an important point that Michael brings up a number of times, that he is concerned that I disagree with Michael's philosophical interpretations of the science, but that doesn't but Michael argues that doesn't constitute a misrepresentation of the science. It's merely a difference in interpretations. Now, I agree there is a difference in interpretations, but I also stand by the claim that Michael misrepresents the science. And I think the most common problem with Michael's presentation is that he gives the impression to, I think, most viewers of his videos that the philosophical implications that Michael, wants to draw from the science are fairly straightforwardly or directly implied by the science that he's responding to, that he's appealing to, whereas that is not correct. I would argue that the interpretations that Michael wants to give of these phenomena are highly idiosyncratic, fringe interpretations that it's hard to find many scholars who are actually publishing in support of. You can find some. It depends on the exact claim, of course. And that what Michael is doing is presenting a picture which most viewers will take as an endorsement of his views, where in fact the work in question in no way implies any of his positions, and indeed his interpretations will be quite idiosyncratic and fringe. It's easy enough to say, look, this is just my personal philosophical interpretation of whatever science, but you could say that about anything, right? You could say, look, I have a philosophical interpretation of the theory of evolution, which says that this is all a divine drama worked out by the Greek gods as they evolve different species for their own ends or whatever. Like, you can say that that's your interpretation and then quote a bunch of evolutionary theorists and fossils and so forth, and present this picture in which you argue for your theory. But I would still say that if you present that in a way where it is implied, or sometimes directly stated, but even just implied by context of the video and everything, and quote selection and so forth, that the work itself supports or lends credence to your interpretation, that you are misrepresenting the science. So I just do not accept that it is sufficient to sort of try to avoid criticism by saying it's merely a philosophical interpretation. If that is all that is being done, then that needs to be made absolutely clear consistently, and the distinction made between what is the science and what is your philosophical interpretation. All right, so that's a broad point there. Now, let's look at some more of the specifics here. It is fairly common for Michael to quote physicists, mostly physicists, sometimes other scientists, who to provide quotes in which they apparently agree with what he's saying. And sometimes they do. I don't want to say that they're always misleading, but I think a lot of quotes are misleading. And one of the main problems here, and this is replete throughout many of his videos, and you will see this here in this response as well, is that Michael quotes physicists talking or writing mostly in a popular context in which they simplify their ideas and try to present them in a way that a regular popular audience can understand. In doing so, they inevitably, make shortcuts and take potentially controversial views, or even just sort of say things in a way that makes it easy to understand that isn't necessarily precisely accurate. Now, that can be a problem when it comes to trying to draw philosophical implications from what has been said. And that is why, and this is kind of a challenge for IP, what I would really like to see is drawing more of this from philosophers who are publishing in philosophical literature, discussing the merits of different interpretations, particularly interpretations that IP would endorse, of these scientific theories. I mean, it can be scientists and philosophers, right? There are people who straddle the boundaries there. But the point is, I think we need to, IP should rely far less on these quotes from popular sources, interviews or talks or popular books, because it's so hard to draw any real philosophical implications from these, because they're often so fuzzy and vague and just sort of simplified. And that's what he usually does not do. In fact, I've struggled to find many quotes or references specifically to philosophers or like physicists working in a rigorous philosophical applications or interpretations of the theories, making an argument for the interpretations that IP is giving. Again, I don't want to say there are none in all of the things that he cites, but I think there are few and far between, and we'll see some of those a little bit later. Anyway, so there's an example of this here. He quotes from Susskind, who is a very prominent physicist, where he says, a three-dimensional world of ordinary experience, stars and galaxies and such, is a hologram, an image of reality sighted on a distant two-dimensional surface. That's fine. That is a popular, this is, if you look up that reference, that's a popular, I think it's a, no, that's a book he did. It's a popular science book. That is a popular level description of what the holographic principle says, but it's not a precise description. In particular, this sentence here, or this phrase here, an image of reality. That is not really part of what the holographic theory says. The holographic theory is about describing information on a three-dimensional surface on a two-dimensional surface, or actually technically it's like an n-dimensional surface on an n-1 dimensional surface. But the information content of a volume can be described on its surface. There's no real sense of an image there, and that's why the hologram word is a bit misleading, because that, I think I talked about this in the previous video, it conjures images of something that's projected and that is sort of like not real, because it's just an image that is made to look real. None of that has any content in the physical theory. That is a misleading implication, and that's the problem with these popular quotes. They don't really illustrate that very or they don't make, that point doesn't come across very clearly. Okay, here's another one talking at the World Science Fair. This is another popular science talk. Information is going to be our starting point. Space-time is not something we start with. We forget about what space and what time is, and then somehow the information, by thinking about how much the information is, what information is doing, then the space-time, what we call emergent, it will come out of just a bunch of zeros and ones. So that's another quote that he likes to use. I mean, that's accurate as far as it goes. But again, it's a very popular level. And again, the zeros and ones, so that's a way of describing information in a popular, or I guess an easy to understand way. It's not like this statement should not be taken literally. It's not like somehow you have zeros and ones. And actually, IP gives a visualization of this in one of his videos where he actually shows the zeros and ones as if they're like some sort of thing that exists, and then the gravity or space or whatever comes out of those. That isn't what the holographic principle is saying at all. Again, the holographic principle is saying that the information content of say a three-dimensional surface can be encoded or is encoded entirely on a, let me say that again. The information content of a three-dimensional volume can be encoded entirely on the two-dimensional surface of that volume. Or likewise for different levels of dimensions, it's one dimension less. That is closer, at least, to what the theory is saying. This description here is a way of describing the emergent relation between, say, space-time and that sort of lower dimensional description. But again, it's misleading to draw any philosophical implications from vague language like this. Oops, I didn't mean to press that link. Okay, yes, so there are physicists talking about it. So Michael says, James is not just attacking me when he says my philosophical implications are grossly immature, he's attacking the physicists. So this is what I'm saying. Neither of these quotes here are philosophical implications. They're popularizations of the content of the holographic principle. You cannot draw any philosophical implications from them. I don't even know, I suspect that the people, so Leonard Susskind and Hockenberry here, themselves are probably not attempting to draw philosophical implications. I'm not sure if they are, but if they are, I would say this is a very bad way of doing it, because there's no rigor or care being given here. It's about exactly how you apply an interpretation to a theory. That's a very difficult thing to do. Philosophers and physicists have worked for decades to try to just construct philosophical interpretations of quantum mechanics. And it's quite difficult to do that, and you need to spend a lot of time and effort doing it. I don't think we're really even at the stage where we can do that for the holographic principle yet, because it's so new. At least I haven't found very much on this that's trying to rigorously do that. So again, these are not, or should not be taken as physicists presenting rigorous, carefully thought out philosophical implications. I don't even think they're trying to present any philosophical implications, but if they are, they should be mostly disregarded. These are popularizations of the content of the holographic principle, and that's all they are. this is precisely how Michael misrepresents philosophy. He presents popularizations of a principle as if they are trying to present or are presenting legitimate philosophical content or interpretations. And I think that's just wrong. Again, even if some of the physicists may think that they can draw philosophical implications, as they sometimes do, I would just say they're wrong about that. Physicists are often very bad at doing philosophy of the interpretation of their own theories. Again, not all of them, it depends on the context. But you have to be very careful there. And that's why I would like to see reference to actual philosophical literature, or at least even physics papers published with a more philosophical or theoretical bent, looking at what the actual meaning or interpretation of these theories is, not just popularized quotes. So yeah, right here, IP is doing it. He's misrepresenting the science, presenting these popularized quotes as if they are philosophical interpretations. They aren't. IP is the one drawing philosophical conclusions from them when one should not do that. Okay, I've also apparently, oh no, he says I might be. Fair enough, because I don't know if I commented specifically on this, implying that the holographic principle is a component of string theory. Now, I don't know if I commented directly on this. What I did talk about is a particular correspondence principle, which is the, what's the name of it again? The CDF. I should have pulled this one up. I've got like 20 tabs open to talk about. Hang on, but I forgot to pull this one up. So there's a particular application of the holographic ADS-CFT, that's the one. ADS-CFT correspondence principle, which is an application of the holographic principle to describe basically to describe quantum gravity in the context of string theory, to put it very briefly. So I think that's what IP is talking about here. And he's saying, well, look, the holographic principle is broader than that and can apply in other theories of gravity as well. So he's quoting from Sabine Hossenfelder here. After having read the paper, this is not, I think, any paper I talked about, it's just something else, explained that their statement that loop quantum gravity violates the holographic principle is wrong. It does not follow from their calculation. Up and back and forth, they agree with me, but refuse to change anything about their paper, claiming it's a matter of phrasing, and in their opinion, it's okay, even though it might confuse some people, which is interesting because this is what I accuse IP of in a lot of cases. But anyway, let me now share that very paper. I think it's a blog post, actually. Why are they in a different order? That is very annoying. What? Here it is. Sorry. We're in the wrong order on my tab set here. Yeah, so here is the blog post that was quoted from. I just want to emphasize this here because this is important to clarify what's being claimed here. Where are we? The claim in this paper is that loop quantum gravity, the most popular approach to quantum gravity after string theory, must be wrong because it violates a holographic principle. The holographic principle requires that the number of different states inside a volume is bounded by the surface of the volume. So this is another way to say that the information content of a volume is or can be contained entirely on the surface of that volume. Now, this originally was developed in the context of black holes, but as it says here, is a consequence of black hole physics, which does not depend on the details of quantum quasi gravity, but it's since been applied to the universe as a whole. Now, why is this relevant? This is relevant because there's a difference between the holographic principle, which is just what was stated there, and ADS-CFT correspondence, which is what I've talked about in some of my previous videos. That's because ADS-CFT is a particular application of the holographic principle. And at least one of the papers that Michael cites, we'll get to later, is appealing to an application of ADS-CFT principle, which is a particular version of the holographic principle. So we need to be careful what we're talking about here. Is that the holographic principle writ large, which is pretty broadly accepted as far as I can tell, and will need to be consistent with whatever version of quantum gravity we end up arriving at? Or are we talking about something specific like the ADS-CFT correspondence or theories derived from that? So I'm perfectly fine if Michael doesn't want to appeal to any very specific application or like instantiation of the holographic principle, but we need to exercise caution here because some of his later results, I think, appeal to something a bit more specific. So we'll come back to that, but that's fine. I'm happy enough if he doesn't want to necessarily appeal to string theory. All right, now what he says here, I have complained that what he's talking about is ADS-CFT correspondence there. and the theory that I mentioned, cannot apply to a universe because we do not live in an anti-de Sitter space, and that's what the theory applies to. Well, he says this is true, but by that logic, we should throw out general relativity because it doesn't apply to every aspect of our reality. It cannot be rectified with quantum mechanics. That's general relativity, he means. Obviously, we're not sure of how general relativity fit into our final theory, but that doesn't mean we should throw it out because it cannot be applied to every aspect of our reality. So again, this quote here is misrepresenting science. And the reason it is because there's a false equivocation there because of the fact that general relativity is probably the most, if maybe the second most, empirically verified theory in the history of science. I won't bother going through that now. You can look this up yourself. The number of separate and independent empirical experimental confirmations that have been made of the theory is just ridiculous. Now, compare that to ADS-CFT correspondence. To my knowledge, that has not had any empirical confirmation at all. The only one that I've ever heard of is the one that Michael cites, and we'll get to that later, but that doesn't actually support the theory. It just fails to rule it out, essentially. So on the one hand, we've got a novel hypothesis that is interesting and certainly is worthy of further research, but doesn't have any empirical confirmation at all. And on the other hand, we have one of the best empirically verified theories in all of science. Now, you cannot equate the two and imply that because both of them are known to be incomplete, as they are, therefore they're on the same evidential standing. The observation that ADS-CFT correspondence doesn't even describe our universe because it's the wrong type of universe. It's an anti-de Sitter space, not a de Sitter space, which is what we're actually in. It is kind of important, right? There's not like an approximation issue there. It just doesn't describe our universe at all. Again, that's not the case for general relativity. General relativity does describe our universe, but at the macro scale. When you get to very, very small space and time, regions of space and time, then there's a problem in that you can't really apply general relativity, or we don't really know how to do that. That's not the true with the ADS-CFT correspondence. It doesn't apply to our universe, period. There's hope that maybe we'll figure out a way to apply it, or it may lead to a different theory, which will be useful. So again, it's completely valid. But there's a complete false equivalence here. So ADS-CFT does not apply to our universe at all, whereas general relativity does, but just not to all aspects. And there is a complete asymmetry with respect to the evidential support in favor of them. There is enormous mammoth levels of support in favor of general relativity. There is essentially no support in favor of ADS-CFT correspondence, empirical support at least. There's theoretical reasons to pursue it, but not empirical support in favor of it. Anyway, so again, I think that's just misrepresenting science. The fact that ADS-CFT correspondence is not empirically confirmed and does not describe our actual universe is a very good reason not to draw any particular philosophical implications from it, even though it appears, and we'll see later when he appeals to it specifically, because he's not appealing to it specifically here, but it appears that Michael wants to do that, and therefore those claims should be, well, rejected, essentially. Oh, I keep clicking on these links because the screen darkening thing that I'm using is doesn't show them up properly. So sorry about that. I'll probably continue to do that. Anyway, so yeah, the holographic principle is different from ADS-CFT correspondence. Remember, the ADS-CFT correspondence is a particular application of that. So that's what this is referring to here. Okay, so I think that there's been an equivocation there, and really overemphasis on what we can draw from these very provisional theories. Does not mean it's not useful and has no explanatory power. That's fine, because I didn't say that it didn't. I just said that we can't draw any philosophical implications from it because the theory hasn't been empirically verified yet. Yep, I agree with that. Remember that there's a difference between the holographic principle. Sorry, I should read what I'm saying here. He says, in any path forward, quantum gravity researchers recognize the holographic principle will be included. That's correct. Yes, the holographic principle is not the same as ADS-CFT correspondence, which is where the anti-de Sitter space point comes in. So I'm happy to say that holographic principle will be part of our completed physics, or quantum gravity. ADS-CFT correspondence, unclear. And again, so this last sentence here, so I stick with what the leading physicists are saying. At no point did I say the holographic principle will be falsified or removed. What I was referring to is Michael's appeal to ADS-CFT correspondence, which is not explicit what we talked to yet, but it is with an empirical paper that he looks at later. And it's there where I'm questioning whether that is the correct approach. And indeed, I don't even think the physicists are really confident in saying it's the correct approach, again, because it doesn't even describe our universe. They just think that it's mathematically interesting and it will probably have interesting implications for developing further theories. So this is misrepresenting science. In this in the context of this paragraph, Michael is claiming that the fact that physicists support or hold to the holographic principle means that his philosophical implications that he draws from that are better founded than mine. But that is false, because I've never objected to the holographic principle. It's the application of that in the context of ADS-CFT correspondence, which Michael appeals to in his videos, that I've objected to. And that is not well evidenced. And the leading physicists are not saying that that is, they're not even saying that that's going to be a description of quantum gravity, because it does not describe our universe, or at least has not been developed in a way that can do that yet. All right, so that's another example of misrepresenting science. The leading physicists are not saying that ADS-CFT correspondence describes our universe, because it does not describe our universe and is not empirically supported there. I think we can leave that quote there. So let's summarize. The holographic principle, it's not the holographic principle itself that's the problem, is drawing implications from that to say that the universe is sort of non-real or emergent or something like that. And that Michael does that in a vague way in the quotes that he appeals to, which I've said, and also in his appeal to ADS-CFT correspondence is grossly premature, because that does not describe our universe and has not been empirically supported. Okay, so this is, I kept saying that we'll get to this bit where he appeals to an empirical study. So this is it here. So this is the study that Michael appeals to when he's talking. So this is misleading here, because he talks about the holographic principle, but this particular study is somewhat vague actually, but it is applying ADS-CFT correspondence models or models drawn from that literature in order to develop models that could be subject to testing. So that, if you're a bit lost in the details here, there is a big difference between the holographic principle, which is just a general principle about basically information in a volume can be described as information on a surface. That's all it is. That's not subject to dispute. No one's arguing about that. The dispute is, what does that tell us about the nature of the universe, and what models can be derived from that or based on that principle to describe the relationship between space and time and quantum gravity and so forth. Michael here is appealing to a study in which he says that the holographic principle, well, rather than me try to summarize what he says, and he accuses me of getting nitpicky here over terminology, which is not nitpicky because it's absolutely critical. You need to be very careful when you're drawing philosophical implications from scientific studies. So I don't think it's nitpicky at all. Rather than me try to summarize what he's saying, it's probably easier for me just to replay that part of the video. It occurs to me. Now, bear with me here because I need to find the right part. I wish he did timestamps in his videos because there's so much stuff there. You can hear for himself. Yeah, this one will be the Emergent Universe. Yeah, you can hear for yourself what he says. So again, you have to be very careful because throughout this piece, he tries to avoid criticism essentially by saying that I'm taking his words out of context, or I'm not listening to the exact wording that he is saying. But I don't think that that's satisfactory. Even if he does not utter the precise phrase, this study proves that what I'm saying is true, or proves my theory, or something like that. What he presents on screen, the order of the presentation, the wording that is chosen, the quotes that I used, et cetera, are all part of the communication that he uses to present his case to viewers. And if, on my reading of that, he is making implications or encouraging the viewer to draw inferences that are not warranted, I classify that as misrepresentation of science. I think that's perfectly fair given the visual medium. Now, of course, you can debate that is my reading of it fair, and and so forth. But so just because he doesn't literally say this proves what I am saying is true, or this proves my theory or whatever, that doesn't mean that the claim is not implicit in what he's presenting here. Okay, so I want to give an example of that with respect to this paper here. And of course, wouldn't you know it, I can't. Oh, wait, no, I just found it. Okay, so let's just rewind a little bit. Okay, so it's around here. Now let me just share this. Okay. So again, the issue is, what is IP saying about this paper in terms of the empirical support it does or does not provide for this specific application of the holographic principle?
With fundamental space, time, and matter. Features of our universe, like the maximum speed, the Big Bang, quantum transitions, and wave function collapse, all make more sense in a virtual world. In other words, the philosophical conclusion is our universe behaves more like a virtual world instead of an objective reality. This aligns with the scientific...
Okay, sorry. That part beforehand was not what I wanted to show. It's hard to get the precise point. So what is he saying here? He's just said there's good reason to think that that the universe is what does he say exactly? I'm going to be careful about misrepresenting him. Our universe behaves more like a virtual world. That's right. So he's just said there's good reason to think that our universe behaves more like a virtual world. Now let's see what he says after that.
Behaves more like a virtual world instead of an objective reality. This aligns with the scientific data we just discussed, which shows space-time and matter are emergent. On top of this, the work in theoretical physics is leading us towards the conclusion the rules of physics and gravity are emergent from the underlying spaceless, timeless quantum realm. All the evidence infers that physical reality is not fundamental, but emergent from underlying information. But there is a much deeper implication here. The wave function explains the emergence of space-time.
That wasn't actually what I wanted to show, although that is the same paper, but there's somewhere else where he discusses that in more detail. You see where it's difficult, how it's difficult for me to find the right parts, because he'll show something and then he'll show it again in a different context, which often makes it difficult for me to find the exact position where he talks about it. But anyway, that will do to make the point, at least, because what he said there, let's listen to it again so that I'm not taking him out of context. So the paper here that he shows up, this one here, is the paper that's in question here about the empirical support of these particular holographic-based models. So what does he say that they do?
Emergent. This aligns with the scientific data we just discussed, which shows space-time and matter are emergent. On top of this, the work in theoretical physics is leading us towards the...
Yeah, so it says, which shows that space-time and matter are emergent. So what is the issue? The issue is that this paper does not show anything. It just shows that there are two models. One is the standard lambda CDM model, and the other is a holographic model, and that they both fit the data equally well. That's all that it shows. It does not show anything about the universe being emergent. You cannot argue that paper provides evidence that the universe is emergent. Even if the universe is emergent, separate point, that paper does not provide evidence for it, because the two models in question fit the data equally well. Go back to my previous video where I go through that. I'm not going to go through it again here. It is misleading. It's misrepresenting the science to say that it supports or shows or does anything of the sort that the universe is emergent. It looks like he might have already presented this here. Maybe if I just jump back here, because he does say more about it there, but even that little quote there is, I think, sufficient to make the point here. It does not show. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, so what else does he say about it? Sorry, I found it again. It's earlier on.
In 2017, when a peer-reviewed study published observable evidence for the holographic principle.
Okay, it's not. So he said it's observable evidence for the holographic principle. It is not evidence for the holographic principle. First of all, there's an equivocation here between the holographic principle in general, which remember is like 3D to 2D, which is not in dispute, and the application of this to holographic cosmology. Note that it says here holographic cosmology. They're talking about derivatives of the ADS CFT models to apply this principle, to describe quantum gravity, essentially. So that's a particular application. And Michael keeps confusing these, it seems. But irrespective of that, this paper does not provide support or evidence for any of these things, because all it does is compare two different models, the holographic-based one and the standard one, and fit them against certain data, and it shows that the models are about as good a fit as each other to that data. There's no statistically significant difference. That's what they show. You can't argue from that it supports one over the other, because there's no significant difference. That's a misrepresentation of the science if you do that.
They tested the model against cosmological observations of the early universe.
Correct.
And found that the holographic model is compatible with the data that is found in the cosmic microwave background radiation.
All right, let's look at this claim here. Is compatible with the data found in the cosmic microwave background radiation. That is true. It is compatible. But what does that mean to the layperson? I actually don't know, right? I'm too far gone with these sorts of things. Now, when I hear a claim like that, I immediately think, well, that's meaningless. I mean, so what? The number of pages in this book that I just picked up is compatible with the holographic model and the microwave background radiation, because it has nothing to do with it. Anything that's unrelated to something will be compatible with it. In an evidential sense, compatible with just means it doesn't refute it. So evidentially, that's completely irrelevant. Well, I guess it doesn't refute it, so okay, that's fine. But that's not evidence for it. Not refuting something is not evidence for it, unless you expect it to be, unless you're directly testing that thing. So the point is here, he can say, yeah, I've just said it's compatible with it, which is what he does say in the response here. He said, I never said the paper shows the holographic model is better than standard models. Okay, but you said it's compatible with the data. What does that mean to the standard person? What is the implication there? Do they know that the standard model also is equally compatible with the cosmic microwave background radiation? Or is there an implication here that when you say it's compatible with it, that means that it's kind of a good thing and that it's outdoing what the standard model is? I know that Michael didn't say this, but this is what I'm saying. From the context of the video, what is the implication that will be drawn by an average viewer? How is it presenting the information? Is it clearly saying that there was no statistically significant difference between the holographic model and the standard lambda CDM model? His video does not say that, and in the context of everything that's showed, attempts to get you to draw the inference that the holographic model was better supported. Let's continue playing to illustrate that point.
From looking at irregularities in the background radiation, their team found that simple equations of quantum field theory could explain almost all the cosmological observations.
So that's a very vague claim there. I think it just means fits to the cosmic microwave background radiation. Again, look at this. Holographic model explains the observational observations. That sounds really good, right? It sounds like the holographic model is being supported. It is not. It is all it is doing. It is equally consistent with the data as the standard lambda CDM model. It is not supported by anything in this paper, but you get that impression if you just look at and hear what he said here.
Is marginally a better fit than the standard model.
Now, this is the phrase that they use, and I critique the authors of the paper using this phrase as well. When they say marginally, what they mean is not statistically significant. In fact, it's not even close to statistically significant if you look at the paper. Again, I showed this in my original video. So that's just weasel words. It means that they didn't find a result. But if you put that in, say, marginally a better fit, first of all, people are just going to ignore the marginally for the most part and just say it's a better fit, which sounds really good. Like, oh, that sounds like it's support. No. It is not supported by the model. Marginally is a weasel word that's used by the researchers to try to make their results sound more significant. And I'm not saying that IP is doing that deliberately here. He is just quoting from the study. But the actual finding is that it is not significant. That is a correct representation of this finding, that there were no significant differences and that the observational data does not distinguish between the two models and therefore does not support either of them over the other. Yet it is presented here as if the holographic model is superior on the basis of these sorts of claims here. Again, Michael doesn't have to directly say that. I'm asking, what will the reasonable viewer, the like ordinary viewer who's not steeped in this stuff, take away from the video? And I think it's perfectly reasonable to claim that the ordinary viewer will take away from this section of it in the context it is, that the holographic model is supported by this study.
It could potentially explain apparent anomalies.
I'm not sure what that refers to.
But this would mean evidence in the cosmic microwave background radiation infers three-dimensional reality is an emergent informational construct. Observable evidence infers reality as we experience is not fundamental, but emerges from the quantum realm.
Okay, and right at the end there, he explicitly says this would show, or this would infer that space and time is emergent, which is equivalent to saying that the holographic model is supported. It is not supported by the data. So not only do we get the implications drawn there from the way it's presented, but an explicit statement that this would infer that the universe is emergent, which again is equivalent to saying the holographic model is supported, because lambda CDM doesn't say anything about whether the universe is emergent. So I just think that that's clear enough. Michael is saying that this paper provides support, provides evidence in favor of the holographic models of the holographic cosmological models, which in turn would imply that the universe is emergent, space-time is emergent. Okay, now what does he say in his response? He says, sorry, I'm just jumping back to that. Okay, I never said the paper shows the holographic model is better than standard models. Well, Michael, I think you did. I think I just showed where you did. Granted, you didn't say it in so many words, and so there's plausible deniability there. But I think that is the implication that any reasonable viewer would draw from what I just showed there, on the basis of the slides and what was presented prior to it, and the claims you made immediately afterwards. He says here, I only note in aspect that there was a marginally better fit. Yes, that's true. Just because the paper says it, again, I'm not. That's not good enough for me, because the paper can misrepresent its own results, and I think they did there. Marginal here means non-significant, and therefore it's a weasel word. So I still think it's misrepresenting, even if the paper misrepresents its own results. I never said the paper argued for any of the musical claims I make. Yeah, but you didn't say that it didn't either. Omission is just as important as what you do say. What you don't say matters just as much as what you do say. If Michael constantly presents scientific results and quotes from scientists, but never explicitly says, I don't think he ever does. I mean, maybe like once. Again, I've got to be careful there. Maybe it does sometimes. But in his videos, he very rarely mentions that the physicists don't agree with any of his, or few of his metaphysical interpretations. Then that is misleading, because that's important when you're trying to present that as consistent with providing evidence for the claims that you're making. So again, I think that is misrepresenting the science. I'm noting this paper says hologram is compatible with the data. Again, that's what does that mean to an ordinary person in the context that it was presented? I think that means it supports it. Again, just look back at what I just showed, and I mean, my viewers here can make their minds up for themselves as to how accurately they thought that was represented. This is an odd example of extending the principle of charity. I think I might do a whole video at some point talking about the principle of charity, but so I'm not going to respond to that particular point here. Also, I didn't argue for the emergent space-time from this paper alone. Okay, fair enough, but you did argue that this paper supports an emergent space-time. So you do think that it supports your view. So I mean, if it doesn't do that, then you're misrepresenting it. Then Michael is misrepresenting the science. It's fine that it's only one piece of the puzzle, but it has to fit in the puzzle, right? And I don't think it does. It doesn't provide any support for an emergent universe. All it does is fail to rule it out, which is not evidence for it. If the paper was as powerful as James assumes I'm stating it is, then would be no need to argue for emergent space-time beyond this. I have no idea what that follows from anything. I didn't say how strong it was. I'm saying that Michael argues that it is support for his view about an emergent universe. It is not support for emergent universe. I mean, even if it was, none of IP's philosophical implications drawn from that would follow, but we're not even talking about that here. We're just talking about the science, and he's misrepresenting the science because it does not support an emergent space-time in the way that he said it did and implied it did. Theoretical physicists like Susskind note the holographic principle is here to stay. Now, again, he's equivocating between the holographic principle and holographic cosmological models. They are not the same thing. Granted, it seems that there will have to be a way to incorporate the holographic principle into cosmological models, but that doesn't mean that any particular one that we have now, such as the ADS-CFT correspondence principle and the models derived from that, are the correct ones. So I think, again, it's misleading to draw a false equivocation between the holographic principle, broadly speaking, which again is just that the information in a volume can be or is expressed or describable on the surface of that volume, on the one hand, and on the other hand, between particular models which say that space-time is emergent from something more fundamental, which is like ADS-CFT, and also we'll get to that with the next couple of sections, like Sean Carroll also argues for this in different contexts, slightly different contexts. That is an equivocation that you're not really helping the reader or the viewer to understand the relationship between those ideas. You're basically, what I think Michael is doing here is he wants to take the agreement and consensus that there is that, holographic principles here to stay, as he says here, which fine, I agree with, and that therefore cosmological models like ADS-CFT that are based on it, but with particular applications and assumptions of their own, are therefore as equally substantiated and evidenced. And that just isn't true, that they are different things. Related, of course, but they're not the same. All right, so I contend, this is just scrolling back here, the holographic principle. Michael equivocates about the holographic principle per se and cosmological models based on it. And also he does, I think, imply and directly claim that the empirical paper that we just discussed provides support for his preferred emergent space-time models, even though it does not. It does not provide empirical support. It just merely fails to falsify the model. All right. Sorry, that's that. Okay, let's look at the next section, Emergence of Space. Now, in this section, I take issue over the point of agreement I share with Sean Carroll that space is not fundamental. So Sean Carroll thinks that's true, and Michael both thinks that as well. That's fine. They think of it for completely different reasons, but they both do agree with that. James admits Carroll doesn't think space... Oh, there's a double negative there, which is confusing. Yeah, Carroll does think space is not fundamental. That's fine. But then appears to be bothered because the context of the quote from my video is talking about space in terms of the Schrodinger equation. James said this is different than cosmology, so I must be taking Carroll out of context. But notice in my video, I was talking about quantum mechanics in this section and how space emerges from entanglement. At this point in my video, I've moved past the data point of the holographic principle, and I'm now arguing for the same philosophical implication from another data point. So ironically, it's me taking things out of context. Now, I'm kind of happy to say that I may have missed the fact that he's moving on to a different piece of evidence for the same principle there, because that wasn't clear to me. I'll play you through that part of the video. I don't think that entirely, well, I don't think that undermines my point. I will say, I did not get that. I did not get that you were saying, here's one piece of, that Michael was saying, here's one piece of evidence that supports his contention. And now here's a different piece of evidence, maybe related but distinct for that. A bit of signposting there would have helped me. I mean, maybe I'm just slow and didn't get that point, but I at least found that confusing. However, let's look at the substance of that point by sharing the video in question. It's actually just after what we were just talking about there. This one, share audio. Okay. So we've just talked about the CFT ADS correspondence and that empirical study that I mentioned, and this is what comes after that.
This piece of data only correlates to a study from later that same year, which points out entanglement is an inevitable feature of reality. Entanglement happens when two...
All right, stop. What does the holographic principle have to do with entanglement? I mean, it has something to do with it. I'm not even sure I could give a clear answer to that, but they're certainly not the same thing. One relates to black holes and information loss, apparent information loss, which needs to be preserved because of unitarity of quantum mechanics, blah, blah, blah. The other one relates to, well, a different principle of quantum mechanics, which I guess relates to unitarity. I'm not explaining all this, by the way. I'm just sort of thinking out loud in terms of, yeah, I guess they're kind of related. And I'm sure you can pull up a paper somewhere that talks about the relationship between the two. What I want to emphasize here is that they are not the same thing. They are different ideas that are kind of in the same area. But if you're just going to jump from one to the other, it's important to make that, or at least moderately clear to the audience, that that's sort of what you're doing. It's not enough just to say this, what do you say, this correlates with something about entanglement, because empirical tests of ADS-CFT cosmological models are very, very different for what's presented here, the fact that entanglement is necessary for all physical theories, which I'm happy to agree with. That does seem to be the case. They're just really different things. And I think it's I don't even want to say this is misrepresenting the science. I think it's just unclear how the connection is supposed to be drawn. But this does have bearing on how we're supposed to interpret Sean Carroll's results. Because remember, when you are watching a video like this, you are appropriately positioned to interpret what comes next based on what just came before it and also what comes after it. Interpretation is not just like, oh, here's one frame and then the next frame or one segment of the video. It forms a whole. So you've got to consider it holistically. So we've just heard him talk about that. Now he's talking about entanglement and emergence. So let's see how they're supposed to relate to each other here.
Two particles interact in a way that their quantum state or wave function cannot be described independently or without the other. However, if you were to separate them by a great distance, a change to one instantly affects the other. This has been demonstrated in several experiments, and now a new study shows that such a phenomena is an inevitable feature of reality. We show that any theory with a classical limit must contain entangled states, thus establishing entanglement as an inevitable feature of any theory superseding classical theory. In other words, any theory which purports to describe reality must include quantum entanglement as an underlying fundamental feature of reality. If you entangle two particles and separate them by a great distance, a change to one will instantly affect the other, regardless of the space between them. So the information between them doesn't seem to be affected by space, implying space is not fundamental for the underlying world of quantum mechanics, but an emergent phenomena of the classical world that only exists after measurement.
So I don't agree with that implication at all there. I was happy with everything he said up until he said space is not fundamental in quantum mechanics and it only emerges after measurement. That just doesn't follow at all. Now, IP can say that that's his interpretation of it, but what was the wording he used again? I think he said implying.
Will instantly affect the other, regardless of the space between them. So the information between them doesn't seem to be affected by space, implying space is not fundamental for the underlying world of quantum mechanics.
There we go. So this might be true that space is not fundamental. I'm not sure. It depends on a bunch of factors about what that means. But it doesn't, you can't say, well, I mean, you can say it, right? But I think it's misrepresenting the science to say that that's implied by the mere fact of entanglement. I disagree with that. I mean, it just depends on how you understand what's happening here. I mean, I would just say that certain states of affairs are non-local. That doesn't mean space isn't fundamental. It just means that certain states of affairs, like quantumly entangled states, are not spatially localized. That doesn't mean space doesn't exist. It means that they're not localized in space. That's equivalent to saying that because things are spread across the space, that therefore the space doesn't exist, or at least is not fundamental. That's just wrong. Now, maybe space isn't fundamental for quantum mechanics. That is what Sean Carroll thinks, right? But he doesn't make the argument that IP is making here. So again, he says implying. No, it doesn't imply that. But anyway, I haven't even got to the main point, which is the quote from Sean Carroll here.
But an emergent phenomena of the classical world that only exists after measurement.
Whereas space is just obviously not fundamental. Space is something where when you go from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, space more or less disappears. In classical mechanics, what do you have? Some particles moving through space with some velocity. In quantum mechanics, you have a wave function of all those particles. And that wave function, we tend to talk a language that the wave function is a function of all the particles and their locations in space, but we don't have to talk that language. We can use what is called the momentum space description. We can completely describe the particles by how fast they're moving instead of where they are in the universe. And for that matter, we don't need to use any description at all. We can just use these quantum mechanical states in their own right, with no reference to space whatsoever.
Remember that in quantum mechanics, prior to measurement, particles have no defined properties or locations. In the absence of measurement, particles simply exist as a wave function of possible states they could take, and that includes the location of the particles. If particles have no defined locations prior to measurement, that would mean the information between entangled particles exists other than spatially. Spatial location only emerges after measurement. Thus, entanglement shows space is not fundamental, but emergent from quantum processes, correlating with the evidence from the holographic principle.
All right, that'll do there. Oh, this is the zeros and ones, remember? Remember there was a quote about the zeros and ones? Here are the zeros and ones, right? I mean, this is all right as a representation, but you really can't take these things too literally. Anyway, so the important point here is that what IP is saying is that, well, he's certainly implying that what Sean Carroll is saying supports his contention. Now, he didn't actually say that. He just said stuff, had the Sean Carroll quote, and then said some more stuff. But given the way it was set up, I think it's fair to say that he thinks that what Sean Carroll said supports what he was saying. The problem is that it really doesn't, because as I discussed in my previous video, Sean Carroll there was talking about something different. He wasn't talking about the holographic principle or holographic cosmology. Indeed, he wasn't even really talking about his preferred interpretation of, his preferred reconciliation of quantum mechanics and general relativity. He was just talking about the fact that you don't have to represent a quantum states in terms of space. You can represent it in momentum space, whereas it seems time is more fundamental because you do need to have a time operator, at least in non-relativistic quantum mechanics. Anyway, again, see my previous video, I'll go through this a bit more. But Sean Carroll was making a different point there than IP was making. I think a substantially different point. I mean, I guess there's some relationship there, but so I think it's misleading to include that here. Now, it's also true, confusingly enough, that Sean Carroll agrees with IP that space and time are not fundamental, but he doesn't think that because of any of the reasons that IP just gave. IP just said that because of entanglement, and because entanglement means that information must be encoded in quantum states non-spatially, therefore space can't be fundamental. That isn't what Sean Carroll argues. Sean Carroll argues, again, very briefly, that quantum entanglement itself actually gives rise to, or is sort of the origin of spatial relationships. So basically, the more entangled two states are, the closer they are in space. When it's sort of like at a higher energy limit, at a low energy limit, space emerges out of the entanglement structure of different quantum states. That's a very loose description of what Sean Carroll thinks. So there is a sort of a connection there with what IP was saying, and maybe he would defend himself by just saying he was sort of gesturing at that in simple language. But I think that was unclear if that was the intention. And in either way, I think that it's misrepresenting the science here. Sean Carroll is presenting a model of quantum gravity and the emergence of space from underlying quantum structures, particularly entanglement. He is not saying that space is sort of not fundamental because entanglement is a thing. In fact, he's almost saying the opposite of that. He's saying that entanglement gives rise to space, which, I mean, maybe that's consistent with what IP said. What IP said is a little bit vague, but at best, I think that IP is just not being clear in terms of what Sean Carroll is saying, what IP is saying, and how they connect to each other. It appears to be that IP has made his particular argument, which I think is just not correct. The fact of entanglement does not imply anything about whether space-time is emergent. And then he's interspersed that with a quote from Sean Carroll, which is about something else, in an attempt to appeal to Sean Carroll's separate views about the nature of space-time, which is not really related to, or at least not in any direct way, or not supported by the arguments that IP gives. So I think that there's just a whole bundle of confusions here about the relationship between this stuff. So I stand by what I said, that this is misleading at best. Now, sorry, I'm just having to jump back to the article. I wish there was a way to do this where I didn't have to keep flipping, but I'm not aware of that. All right, back to the article. So Carroll and I agree. Carroll and I agree, and this is all I did when I included this quote. No, it's not all you did, because it implies that Carroll in that quote is supporting what you've said. You can't make an argument, put in a quote from someone that appears to support that, and then put more argument, and then say that all you're doing is illustrating that Sean Carroll and you and Michael agree on one very specific point. The implication there is that Sean Carroll is agreeing with and substantiating the argument that Michael is giving, but he is not. He's making a different point. And the other things that he believes about space and time are also different. So it's misleading. What I found odd, he admits that what I'm describing is similar to what Sean Carroll is saying. So what is the issue? Well, I think I've described what the issue is there. It's a misleading representation of the relationship between these different ideas of entanglement and emergent space-time. There may be a relationship between them, but not in the way that Michael has argued in that video. And Sean Carroll doesn't agree with Michael in terms of the origin of that connection. and certainly disagrees with Michael with respect to the philosophical implications that should be drawn from that. So let's move to the emergence of time. So in this section, I take issue with the paper that Michael cites about an experiment that seems to confer the idea that time is also an emergent phenomenon. Notice the language I use, because James takes the most issue with this and keeps implying I exaggerated the power of the evidence, which I think he did. James says the experiment doesn't prove that time is emergent, and of course I agree. Well, that's good, because it doesn't. Luckily, I never said that. Ooh, okay. I only said it seemed to confirm this idea. Okay, he didn't say that it proved it. It just seems to confirm it. So if something seems to confirm it, what are we supposed to infer from that? That you think it does confirm it, perhaps? At least provides evidence for it, but actually it doesn't, as I argued in the previous video. I'm not going to go through that again here. The experiment that he cites only shows an experimental illustration of the type of mechanism that some have postulated might give rise to emergent time. It does not in any way provide evidence that time actually is emergent. It's like, here's a toy model of a mechanism that could be relevant. It's not like here it actually is evidence that it's emergent. It's a completely different type of thing. It's still interesting, perfectly valid physics, but it doesn't provide any evidence that time actually is emergent, right? Again, look at the previous video for more on that. So it does not in any way confirm or provide evidence for that idea. It doesn't refute it. Again, it doesn't falsify it, sure, but that's not really that relevant. Now, it's not enough to say, well, I didn't say that it proved it. It just seemed to confirm it. I mean, come on. Is that really the verbal games we're playing here? Michael accused me of making semantic points, but now he is the one distinguishing between claiming that it proved it and claiming that it seemed to confirm it. If you say it seemed to confirm it, then that is saying that this paper provides evidence in favor of time being emergent, but it does not. It only provides evidence of a mechanism that could be relevant to a time emergent type phenomenon, which I actually think is super interesting, but it doesn't provide evidence that time actually is emergent. Completely different claim. So whatever words he uses to say it, whether it's prove or seems to confirm, that is misleading to say that, because it does not, the study does not show that. Noting a study supports the overall case is not claiming the entire case rests on the one data point. I agree, but it doesn't support the overall case. All it does is show that a mechanism that maybe it's a toy model of a mechanism of a sort that could be relevant, but that it doesn't support the case in the sort of way that Michael is claiming here. Also, this once again is not an example of misrepresenting science, because I never said that this proves that time is measured. No, but you said it seems to confirm the idea, which it doesn't. Perhaps we should consult the video and see what he says for himself. Again, if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. Hang on. Hope this is the right one. I think this, hang on, I'll just check here. Yeah, this is it. Okay, I'm going to share the video again so you can make up your own mind about what he claimed about that experiment. This one, share audio, share audio, share audio.
That would have to mean that time is also emergent from the underlying quantum realm. And an experiment from 2013 reveals this. The Wheeler-DeWitt equation,
this is the experiment,
which calculated the wave function of the universe, noted the time factor dropped out, meaning time is also not a fundamental aspect of the underlying quantum world, but emergent in the classical world that we experience day to day.
I should say the Wheeler-DeWitt equation is a very old equation derived from a very simplistic quantization of general relativity. It's not really used anymore. The fact that time drops out from it has no implications whatever about the existence of time or its emergence. So this is also false. Again, time may be emergent, but the fact that it drops out from the Wheeler-DeWitt equation does not support that at all. But this is sort of a side point.
And in 2013, an experiment seemed to confirm this idea that time, along with space, is an emergent phenomenon.
So in quantum gravity, now.
All right, I think that's all we get. So he said it seemed to confirm the idea. Now, there's weasel words if I've ever heard them. It seems to confirm it. I mean, does it or does it not? Like, the point is that you can, because that's such a vague claim, you can easily just say, well, I never said it did. I said it seems to. So if I'm wrong, well, it didn't seem to, right? I guess the question would be, does it provide evidence in favor of that or does it not? I think that from the context of the video, it is clearly presented as providing evidence that time is emergent, like the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, neither of which provide any evidence that time is emergent. And indeed, I think time probably is emergent, right? But the point is IP misrepresenting the science to provide evidence in favor of what he thinks of his preferred, metaphysical or philosophical conclusions, and that's the point I'm saying here. He's misrepresenting the science. He's I think misleading about the way that what he thinks it means for something to be emergent. But we'll get to that later. Okay, so I've gone through all of that. Okay, my overall case up to this point relied on the holographic principle, the fact that space and time are one thing in relativity, and our space appears to be emergent. I then point out the Wheeler-DeWitt equation supports this notion, which it doesn't, and the conclusion also shows how this. Oh, sorry, the experiment also shows how this could work, thus supporting the overall conclusion. Well, that's a bit of a different claim. The experiment provides experimental support of a toy model of a type of mechanism that could be relevant to these models. So in that very limited sense, I may agree, but you have to be very, very careful about that claim. And I don't think the video provided anything close to the level of clarity or context about what is being claimed there. So again, I'm happy to say that misrepresents the science there. So I'm misrepresenting the emphasis placed on one study I briefly mentioned. But the problem, Michael, is that almost all of your studies are brief mentions. So you can always say, oh, I just briefly mentioned, I said it seems to support it, may support it. But if you just only briefly mention most of these studies, then that's the problem, that there isn't the time to provide the context or explain what they actually mean. And this is my claim. Almost all of the studies are just brief mentions to things that don't actually support, or like the experimentals I just mentioned, only in a very limited way, depending on how you look at it, so forth, provide any support for the claim being made. So that's precisely the problem. And using weasel words like, oh, it appears to support or it seems to support, it just makes the whole problem worse. It's a way of misrepresenting the evidence without explicitly claiming that it supports what you're saying. But from the context of the video, I think that it's fairly clear what the viewer should draw from that. Okay, also take issue with including a video of Fontini, that name, talking about a space-time problem not fundamental. He notes that she has a different model and doesn't agree with my metaphysical worldview, again, as most of these scientists don't, which is true. I never said otherwise. Okay, what's the problem here? It's true that he never said otherwise, but he didn't say either way. This is the problem. Omission is just as important as what you do say. To continually provide these quotes which make it sound like the scientists agree with what IP is saying, whereas in fact, they don't agree with any of his metaphysical interpretations, or I would argue even the reasons for arriving at them. Remember the Sean Carroll case. The argument that Sean Carroll gives is completely different to the one that Michael gave about why entanglement and space are related. So that in itself is misleading. You should at least say, look, they don't agree with what I've drawn from this, but at least they're talking about the idea of emergence or something like that. Even though there's still issues with what they mean by emergent. But the point is, not saying otherwise doesn't get you around this. You need to provide enough context for your viewers to appropriately understand and interpret the science you're appealing to, that IP is appealing to. And I do not think he does that. And this is another example of that. I'm only quoting a point of agreement, not claiming she agrees with my overall case. If you just cherry pick a bunch of people who agree with you on some points but not others, that is misleading. You don't have to say that they agree with you on everything else, but if you never mention anything of that sort, it's misleading. All right. Let's see. James repeatedly says that this research doesn't show the space and time are not real. Yes. Okay. So this is very important because this is sort of more the implications of this. Are not real. They're just not fundamental. This is a game of semantics. So now I'm being accused of semantics here. I've never understood this. Semantics is about the meaning of words. So obviously that's important when we're doing philosophy and trying to understand science, right? We need to get our words right. So yeah, it is semantics, but it's very important semantics. I agree space is real, but what I mean is defined in the context of my video as meaning space is not real, like a naive realist would think of space and time. Physicists talk about gravity as being an illusion. Yes, they do say that. That's a way of popularizing it, and it's misleading. I also oppose that usage by physicists, but it's true that you will hear them saying that sometimes. And this is the same understanding as they are trying to get at if you read their work in context. James doesn't agree with the use of the terminology. Yeah, I don't, because it's misleading. But as I said to him in our debate, it's not as if we are just saying space and time are not real without explaining what it means. Okay, so does he say that? Does IP say that? Now I have to remember which part of the video I wanted to appeal to. I'm pretty sure it continues from here. So let me finish this paragraph and then we'll go back to the video and see if he does imply that they're not real, or see if he provides the context for understanding what emergent means. Throughout the rest of this reply, I'm not going to respond to James when he doesn't think I'm using the right words. Oh dear. If you cannot interpret words in their context, there's nothing to engage on this issue. So if you read philosophical papers, as I'm sure Michael would know, a lot of the time, different authors will take issue with the use of particular words, because that is what a lot of philosophical debate is about. It's like, what is this word that we're using here? How are we using it? Are we using it correctly? Are we being sufficiently cautious? Is there an implication that's wrong here? Are there counterexamples that would be relevant to this usage? How does this usage connect with other usages for other terms that we have? This is just not good enough. If words are being used in a misleading way to misrepresent the science and draw and encourage people to think in an inaccurate way, then that use of the words needs to be challenged and needs to be corrected. So I think this is completely unsatisfactory as a response. To say, well, if he can't understand what I mean, then that's his problem. If I can't understand what you mean, or if I'm misunderstanding your words, then you need to be more careful, I think, about how you are using those words. And indeed, I think it's not just me not understanding. It's insufficient context has been given such that the viewer will get a misleading impression. So let me give an example of that in this video here. And I may have to play a little bit because I don't exactly remember where he talks about it, but we will get there. Okay. Oh, share audio, share audio, share audio. Okay, here we go. So that's Fontini there. Let's move past
an emergent
that.
One. So it's the emergent one that is part of the space-time. but there is a more fundamental one that makes sense without space.
Now, neither one of those new ways are obvious to us in our common perception, obviously, but Einstein put space and time together, which was a radical change. What you're saying is that the time that he might have unified with space may be an emergent time, and there's something more fundamental in time.
Thus, all of what we experience, space, time, matter, all seem to be emergent constructs of the classical world, not fundamental aspects of reality. Experimental data shows us matter and space-time are emergent, while in contrast, another experiment shows the wave function is fundamental to reality. At the advent of quantum mechanics, many...
Okay, so note that he used the word there, emergent construct. So what is an emergent construct? If you say something is an emergent construct, does that sound like it's something that's real? I mean, it's a bit vague what is meant there, but I would contend that most people hearing that, especially with the imagery there, that with this sort of ethereal quantum numbers, whatever, that doesn't appear to be providing an implication that what he's talking about is being real. It sounds like it's not real, or at least barely real. I mean, it's a bit, again, it's vague here, but an emergent construct with this sort of imagery, what is being said there? Okay, so let's think about it. When physicists say that space-time is emergent, they just mean it's a higher order phenomenon that doesn't appear in the very basic physics of physical description of the system. What are some other examples of emergent phenomenon using the same definition there? Chairs, computers, people, planets, galaxies, atoms, in fact, almost everything else are emergent phenomena in this sense. So if we replace space and time with any of those words, that should be equally acceptable, right? And the meaning would follow, right? So, let's say atoms. Atoms are an emergent phenomenon from the underlying physics. Are they an emergent construct? No, they're just not fundamental. They don't appear in the fundamental equations. They arise out of it at particular, low energy limits and such. That is what the physicists are saying when they say emergent. Would you get that out of watching this video? I contend you would not, because there's no clarification there about what is meant by emergent and how, in fact, all of these other things, including, say, atoms, are also emergent using the same definition. And this is fundamental because IP wants to draw the implication that this provides evidence for idealism because, well, they're not real, they're not material, maybe they're mental in some way, they're ideas. But no such inference is appropriate because, again, emergent just means don't appear in the fundamental equations, just like atoms and planets and people don't. It's very misleading because he never defines this and is never clear on it. And when he uses a phrase like emergent construct, well, again, what does that encourage the viewer to think? Does that sound like something is an atom an emergent construct? Is a person an emergent construct? Is a table an emergent construct? According to the way IP is using the words, then all of those sentences would be true. But I mean, well, I guess the table's a construct that humans make it, but you get the point, right? You wouldn't say that of any of these other things. But it would be appropriate to say those things if, in the way that, I guess, if IP is being consistent in his uses. And because of that, I think that it's pretty clear it's misleading the way he's describing this. I think that he says some other things as well. I just want to see.
The emergent description from something else.
The implications of this are quite astonishing, because the wave function is not a physical object extended through space, but a mathematical probability of where physical particles will appear in space. Sean Carroll explains, mathematically, wave functions are elements of a mathematical structure called Hilbert space. That means they are vectors. We can add quantum states together, the origin of superpositions in quantum mechanics, and calculate the angle, or dot product, between them. The word space in Hilbert space doesn't mean the good old three-dimensional space we walk through every day, or even the four-dimensional space-time of relativity. It's just math speak for a collection of things, in this case, possible quantum states of the universe. The underlying truth of the universe is a mathematical reality from which the classical world we experience emerges. What we think is objectively real is nothing more than an emergent construct of underlying mathematical informational processes.
There we go. That's what I was looking for. Let me play that again. So remember, in the sense of emergent that physicists are using, you can also say that people, galaxies, planets, atoms, chairs, everything else are all emergent. Now, let's see how IP describes that.
Reality from which the classical world we experience emerges. What we think is objectively real is nothing more than an emergent construct of underlying mathematical informational processes.
Yeah, so what we think is objectively real is no more than an emergent construct of underlying mathematical processes. Now, actually, it occurs to me that IP may actually be happy to say that literally everything is like that, I guess because he is an idealist, right? But the point here, and I think, again, given the imagery and the context, is that the viewer is going to understand this to mean that the quantum mechanical processes, including space and time, are emergent, and then sort of everything else comes with it. But that really isn't what the physicist is saying. All that they are saying is yeah, not that they're emergent constructs out of the mathematics, but just that space and time, as well as atoms and everything else, do not appear at the most fundamental level of the equations that they're trying to describe the physical system in, and they're phenomena that appear in particular manifestations of those equations. That is all that it means. It does not have any further implication about, well, literally anything else. The relationship between mathematics and physical reality is an interesting one. I don't want to get into that here because that has a whole host of other issues that we didn't get into. But again, I think that this is very misleading because this notion of emergence has not been clearly defined, nor is IP clearly explaining the relationship between the science and what the science actually establishes. Because remember, he's showing quotes from Fratini and from Sean Carroll and from others that talk about emergence, and then he's then using his notion of emergence, which is trying to applies to an idealist context where, I mean, everything is an idea, right? And physical reality doesn't exist fundamentally. He just weaves between those and switches between those seamlessly without providing clear context here. And so I think that he absolutely is misrepresenting what the scientists are saying as if they are supporting his metaphysical claims when they do nothing of the sort. And the notion of emergence here has been just dramatically underexplored and not defined in a clear way that the viewer can understand. So again, I think it's perfectly legitimate to say he's misrepresenting the science there because it's been presented in a very unclear way that lends undue credence to his or undue support to his preferred point of view there. All right, so that concludes the part about the emergence of time and emergence generally. Now, this part about the reality of the wave function, I actually think that we don't disagree very much, so I'm not going to go over this part in detail. Because basically he says in this paper, and I didn't appreciate this, so this could be my my limited understanding of what IP was trying to say, because apparently his point about referring to this is that he's saying that where does he say this? Now, perhaps I wasn't clear enough in my video. However, I was operating within this scientific realism framework because he doesn't find instrumentalism to be very convincing. So within that realism framework, this paper here that he cites about the reality of the wave function, I talk about in the previous video, within that particular framework, that paper purports to show that the wave function refers to something real in reality, or is a description of something that's real in reality. Now, what I pointed out is that paper assumes a realist framework. It doesn't prove that framework, but apparently IP was fine with that and was happy to just work within that assumption. He wasn't saying that paper proves that was correct. So if that was what he intended to say, I'm fine with that. And I apologize if I misunderstood him to be saying that the paper proved that realistic framework was correct, whereas in fact it assumes that framework and shows within that framework the wave function must refer to something real. So I'm quite happy with that. In terms of what he said there, and if I misunderstood him, then that's my mistake there. I don't think that I don't have any objections to anything else he says up here. However, if one tries to say the wave function is just a mathematical tool, but still holds to a scientific realist position, then this study I cited creates problems. I agree, and that is what the study shows, so that's fine. Now one has to hold backwards in time causation or hold to an instrumentalist view, but such a person would not even consider any scientific data relevant or fall outside our framework, which is fair. So if you're an instrumentalist, none of this is going to be relevant anyway. So on that point, I'm in agreement, and I think the science does support what he's saying there, and I misunderstood the point he was trying to make there. To be fair, I think it was a little unclear in the video. He seems to indicate that perhaps that's the case, but I mean, I'm unclear sometimes too, so I'm not going to hold that against him because I don't think that. So I don't think on that point he misrepresented the science. Now, let's look at the world as virtual reality. So this is that awful paper by the computer scientist who just has that table of like comparisons between certain aspects of physics and things in virtual reality. Again, see my previous video. I'm not going to go through that here. Basically, he says, look, he doesn't want to spend too much time on this. He doesn't use it much anymore. I don't use it as much as when I used to, which is good because it's an awful paper. At best, I call upon it for secondary evidence. I mean, it's not really evidence of anything in my point, but okay, fine. He also says that he doesn't he doesn't portray it as a scientific paper. I don't think that that's clear from IP's videos that this is not a scientific paper. Again, I won't go through that now because I don't think it's a massively important point. I don't think he really distinguishes it. In fact, I think he's just not referred to this at all because I don't think it's useful for anything. But okay, fine. If he doesn't want to be appealing to this for anything in particular, then I'm not going to belabor that point. He's making a philosophical inference by comparing world physics. I don't even think he does that because there's nothing really philosophical in the paper. It's just really trivial, surface level comparisons of two ideas without any clear justifications. If it's philosophy, it's terrible philosophy. If it's science, it's terrible science. I don't know what it is. It's a joke. But that's fine. If he doesn't want to appeal to it too much, then that's not an issue. Okay, so let's move past that. So again, if he's not presenting that as science, then I'm happy to say he's not misrepresenting science. I mean, this isn't science. I think that that's not as clear from some of the videos where it appears. So I will say there that there's a lack of clarity in some of the videos. But again, I won't belabor that too much. Let's move on to quantum cognition. Okay, so quantum cognition is the application of models and models and mathematical techniques from quantum mechanics to apply to understand certain aspects of cognition and human decision making and such. Now, the first thing Michael says is that I suggest that Michael's use of quantum cognition is inconsistent with his appeal to the idea that that consciousness collapses the wave function. I'll explain that in a moment. But he says this is not accurate because I think that's me, I'm assuming reductionism and non-idealist concepts. In other words, Michael is saying that the mind, he is not saying the mind reduces to quantum mechanical processes, but that minds manifest in quantum-like ways when in a physical reality. For example, in the video, I respond to, hang on, I've got to be careful who's saying what here. So Michael says the inner world of the mind should be modeled with the properties of quantum mechanics, and under idealism, the brain is simply the physical manifestation of the mind. I specifically said these things this way to avoid the objection I'm claiming the mind reduces to quantum mechanical processes. I never say consciousness reduces to quantum mechanics, but that minds act or behave in the fashion of the rules of quantum mechanics. Interesting. This is something I explained extensively in Quantum Biology, Irreducible Mind. Well, that's a different series. I don't want to get into that here. Now, that's okay in the as far as it goes. The issue here is he does quote he shows videos and excerpts from Hamerhoff here, who does argue that the mind is a quantum process, like that quantum processes give rise to the mind, which seems to be the opposite of what, or close to the opposite at least, of what Michael wants to say, which is basically that the mind is essential for the operation of quantum processes, particularly the collapse of the wave function, which he does say. So in other words, there's sort of two views here. One is quantum mind, and that's what Hamerhoff argues for. The other is consciousness causes collapse. Consciousness is some sort of immaterial thing that causes collapse of the wave function. I don't think you can reconcile those two views, because one takes quantum to be primary and explains mind in terms of it, whereas the other takes mind primary and uses it to understand quantum mechanics. I fail to see how you can reconcile those. Now, to be fair, IP doesn't say that he is trying to do that here. I do think it's a bit misleading from his videos, because he does say consciousness causes collapse on the one hand, but then he also quotes from Hamerhoff and talks about quantum cognition in a way that makes it seem like he's appealing to those sorts of views here. But now he distances himself from that by saying Hamerhoff believes collapse in QM creates consciousness, but Stapp, who's a different physicist, believes consciousness causes collapse, and I'm more in line with Stapp's view, right? So IP is clarifying here, which I didn't get on watching these videos, that he doesn't agree with Hamerhoff when he's talking about consciousness causing collapse. He doesn't agree with, Michael doesn't agree with Hamerhoff when Hamerhoff is talking about the idea that quantum mechanisms and principles give rise to the mind and cognition. So that was unclear to me, but okay, that's fine. That's not really science, that's just that's philosophy. But okay, so now I understand that. So that's good. That point's been clarified there. Again, I don't think it was entirely clear from the videos, but okay, that's fine. Now we move on to quantum cognition per se, which is a mathematical approach to model various cognitive phenomena using the formalism for quantum mechanics. Now, I contended that just because two things are describable using the same formalism doesn't mean they are the same thing, or even that they are related. And I used an example of the concept of equilibrium from chemistry, which has been borrowed to apply to the economy. Now, IP responds by saying equilibrium is a vague concept that can apply to a lot of areas. Well, yes, it can be applied to a lot of areas, but it is not a vague concept. It is a very precise mathematical concept. The precise way you formulate it, I guess, will depend on the application. But the basic idea is you have competing dynamical variables or equations is a better way to say that, which balance out in a particular context or a particular situation, which is then an equilibrium. The simple example for economics is supply and demand. There's a supply of something, there's a demand of something, and those will balance out at the equilibrium where the market will clear. And that's where you get those sort of graphs intersecting, to put it very crudely. Ideas from equilibrium, dynamical equilibrium in chemistry were explicitly, and statistical mechanics as well, were explicitly borrowed and applied to economics to understand some and model some of these processes. And if that, however, if for whatever reason you don't like that example, I've got another example, Poisson's equation. In fact, I'll show this here. Poisson's equation is a differential equation, which finds application in Newtonian gravity, electrostatics, and also in fluid dynamics. So there is an equation, a precise equation, which is stated there. I won't try to describe it because it's not important for our purposes here, that finds application in three completely different areas. That is, again, Newtonian gravity, electrostatics, and fluid mechanics. Now, are we to say that all of those things are like directly related or the same because they can be, aspects of them can be modeled using that same equation? No, it just means that there's a formal correspondence between particular aspects of the theory. Nothing further follows from that. It's very common to actually find in science that equations or mathematical formalisms developed in one context will be useful for another context. Differential equations, that's just one example of a differential equation, but there are many such equations that find application in many different areas. The notion of an equilibrium is another one. There are all sorts of equilibria which apply very similar types of mathematics to understand them. What about probability theory? That was originally developed to describe gambling, but is now applied all across the board in basically all sciences. The examples can be multiplied here, that just because you're using the same formalism or a similar formalism or even the same equation, it doesn't in any way mean that the phenomena are related. So I don't think this is a very good response here. It's not a vague concept. It's a precise mathematical concept. I could say my mind is at ease and reach equilibrium, or I could use it to refer to the traffic flow or talk about the movie from 2002. The movie. Yeah, that is not at all what I'm saying. I'm not saying the word is used in both cases. I'm saying the mathematical tools are very closely related in both of the contexts. And equilibrium doesn't mean that your mind is at ease or something like that. It means that there is a balance between dynamical variables within a system with particular properties. So I think that this is not a good response to the point here. This is not a good comparison to correlation of finding quantum cognition. Well, I think it is. I think it's another example of how a mathematical framework has been taken from one field or application and applied in another. Mathematics is a very abstract discipline. So naturally, I think it's not surprising that formalisms useful in one context will find a different application to describe abstract relationships that are manifested in a different context. So I think that is a perfectly valid comparison. And I think that it is misrepresenting to say that because you've got quantum cognition as an application of quantum mechanical models, that therefore this tells us anything about the nature of the mind as a quantum object. Maybe there's a few people like Hammerhoff who are arguing that, or even him, he doesn't actually agree with what IP is saying, right, as we just established. But the point is, this is not a standard view. This does not follow from the theory, and it's a misrepresentation, I argue, of the science to say that it does. And I've used the example of other cases where you can use formalisms in different contexts to illustrate that point. Okay, it has remarkable success. I don't have a firm view on that. That's an open question. We'll see how it goes. Let's see. I don't want to go through all of this because I think I've made my point there. I think that the comparison I've made is completely valid there, and he is being misleading in saying that. There's more than merely applying general concepts like equilibrium. Yeah, well, he's completely missed the point when I say that because the word equilibrium applies in the two cases. I'm talking about the specific mathematics there, but I feel like I've belaboring that point. Now, I cite a particular paper on quantum cognition, which argues that the only relevant aspects of quantum mechanics that are applied are contextuality, which we've talked. Oh no, actually, we haven't talked about that yet. I talk about it in my video. And my main point there is that it seems that all these quantum models use interference, and that's a wave phenomenon. So what we're actually seeing is an application of wave mechanics, not quantum mechanics per se. Even if more aspects of the formalism are being used, it appears that wave mechanics would be sufficient. And that's what that paper argues there. Now, Michael disagrees with this because he says, well, there's lots of applications here. This paper doesn't consider all of them. And there have been papers since then that have applied different cases. He says he was anticipating this objection, but it wasn't mentioned, so that seems irrelevant. I also brought up problems with James' argument. I don't actually think I've watched that review. Intentionally cherry-picking, but it seems odd that he only cites this one paper. Well, I'm not sure how many papers I'm supposed to cite here. We could cite papers until the cows come home. The point that I was making is, as this paper argued, that it seems that many of these applications, it would be sufficient to use wave mechanics models, which actually that's what quantum mechanics is. It's wave mechanics, at least classical quantum mechanics. And that I think that Michael is misrepresenting the situation here in saying that there's some intrinsic link between cognition and quantum mechanics, when really it's about wave mechanics and the properties of waves with interference and such. Now, he does say that since a more recent paper has well, I'm not going to read through all this, different applications of these theories, I don't actually think this has much bearing on it. One interesting point is whether there is applications of non-locality, which is something that is distinctly quantum. And the paper that I cited says is not used in quantum cognition. Now, Michael refers to a few papers here which do apparently discuss application of the notion of non-locality in cognitive models. I had a look at one of these. I've forgotten which one it is now. I think it might have been this one here. So yeah, okay. So some quantum cognition models have, at least a couple of them, have used non-locality or claim to see to use the principle of non-locality as it applies in quantum mechanics in their models. It's unclear to me. I mean, I had a quick look at it, didn't look like much to me, but I don't want to go through the details here. So, okay, sure, some people might be appealing to that. I think it's still an open question as to how much of the quantum formalism is actually necessary for any of the success of these results. Just because you borrow a formalism hook, line, and sinker doesn't mean you actually need all of that formalism. I suspect a lot of these are really wave mechanics phenomena, such as interference would be the classic example of that. There's nothing quantum about that per se. It's just an effect of waves. And many of the things mentioned here in this example here, bistable perception, overdistribution in semantic memory, entanglement in associated memory, violations of decision-making, probably adjustment errors, a lot of that stuff, I mean, those are applications, right? It's unclear whether the models behind it require the entire formalism of quantum mechanics or just a wave interference model or similar or similar types of effects. I don't know. You'd have to look at all the papers in question, and I certainly haven't done that. So to me, it's an open question how much of quantum mechanics these models actually require. And I think that this paper that I cited makes an absolutely valid point in that respect. So is Michael misrepresenting the science? I think he is, in the sense that it is not at all clear that this field of research is requires the full machinery of the formalism of quantum mechanics, for a start. And for another thing, it's not clear that even if it did, that it has any relationship to quantum mechanics as a physical phenomenon. Neither of those things were really discussed. I think maybe he mentioned that maybe it's just a coincidence. So maybe he very briefly mentioned one of those possibilities. But basically, IP doesn't sort of mention this or discuss this or present it in a way where the viewers can really understand the context. I think viewers are just going to get a naive view that, oh, wow, they're applying these quantum models. That must mean that like the mind is quantum. I think that is what the average viewer is kind of going to get out of that. Whereas these models do not straightforwardly or really in any way, I think, imply that at all. You may draw that implication, but that requires very precise and careful argument, which isn't provided. Isn't provided, I think, in most of these papers that I've read, and certainly isn't provided by Michael. So as he says at the end here, perhaps I will be right, and the quantum modeling will be just as powerful as the research is indicating, but the current data is not pointing in that direction. I don't quite understand, because I feel like I'm saying that we don't need the full quantum modeling. We can just use wave mechanics. But anyway, I guess the point is, that this is an open question. So, I mean, because it's so new, I don't really take it to be very persuasive one way or the other. But I feel like, he says here that he doesn't want to overburden people with papers, which is fair enough. But again, Michael is the one presenting this evidence here. And I do not think he's providing sufficient background for people to understand what he is saying and the limits of what he is saying there and some of the relevant controversies about how to interpret this stuff. So I will grant that the 2009 paper that I cited is a little old, and there are some things that have been cited that have been provided, some papers published since then, which do perhaps apply additional aspects of the formalism, although it's unclear how successful or relevant they are. So I will take that. I'll take that on board. But nevertheless, I think that it's still the whole literature here has not been correctly or not been sufficiently accurately presented with enough context and clarification as would need to be in order for the viewer of the videos in which this is presented to understand what the actual state of the scientific evidence is here. And in that sense, I think, again, that Michael here is misrepresenting the science here. All right, let's continue. Neurons in the cosmic web. This is kind of one of my favorite ones here. So this is the study that I mentioned that we discussed, where the researchers try to show that there are similarities between the cosmic web of galaxies and neural networks, or I guess it's really not networks. It's the density of neurons in the human cortex. So I say, we have no idea why you would expect the brain to look like the cosmos if idealism is true, because they are just two different things existing in God's mind. Why not trees or clouds or anything else? I don't know why you would connect these two. So he doesn't really explain that in the video, so I was interested to hear what a response is. So here's the reason. The reason is that clouds and trees are not representations of minds on idealism. I mean, first of all, how do we know that? Like, if everything is something in God's mind, wouldn't they all be like representations of God's mind? I don't know. Like, how do you know what is a representation of a mind? Anyway, but okay, let's just go with that. They are reduced to mere physical phenomena within the mind. But doesn't everything reduce to physical phenomena within the mind, including other minds? No, but he's a dual aspect idealist. So IP thinks that minds are not physical. It's not like it's mind reduced to the physics, reduces to the simulation. It's trees reduced to the physics, reduced to the simulation. But minds are directly part of the simulation, except for God's mind, which gives rise to the simulation. I find this worldview extraordinarily confusing. So I'm doing my best to understand what he's saying here. So, okay, so I don't know what the mirror is doing here, by the way, but anyway. Okay, so minds are different to clouds and trees because they don't reduce to physical simulations in the mind. They're non-physical simulated things. Okay, I mean, I don't even know how we know that, but maybe he would make his different properties or something argument. Okay, this would be like asking ideals why a single atom in the brain is not a representation of the mind. I don't even know what you mean by what IP means by a representation of the mind. Isn't idealism saying that like everything is ideas in the mind? Or I guess IP means God's mind. What does it mean to have a representation of the mind in the simulation? I don't actually understand that. The inanimate universe as a whole must be in a certain sense akin to a brain. Well, I don't know why we should accept that. But anyway, oh, that's it. Okay, so the universe, okay, so I'm trying to understand what IP is saying here. I think what he's saying is this. God is a mind, and the universe, the cosmos as a whole, is a representation of his mind. We are also minds in the simulation, and our brains are a representation of our mind in the simulation. So the cosmos is to God's mind as our brains are to our mind. No, but that can't be right because our brains give rise to our mind, and there's the interaction between them and our minds and so forth. But no, he's not an interactionist dualist. Okay, so but what is the relationship between mind and brain then under his theory? What is the brain doing, in other words? It's got to be doing something, because you've got all those correlations between mental states and brain states, right? So there has to be something going on there, unless you want to say that they're just two parallel streams and God makes them all, what's that, parallelism, I think it's called, and they just happen to reflect each other and God is the one who ensures that they do. But that's kind of misleading and confusing, isn't it? And why would God even do that? So that doesn't seem like a very plausible theory. I think we can stop this here because you can see that I still can't make head or tail of why you would expect this, because the best I can get out of this is that IP thinks that the cosmos, like the galaxies in the cosmos, play the same role to God as the neurons in our brain do to our cognition. But that doesn't seem to make any sense for a whole bunch of reasons. Like, the universe isn't God's brain. IP wants to say that it's a physical manifestation of the brain, but like, what does that mean? Does that mean the mind causes that to manifest in some way? But why would it manifest at all? Why does it need that? What's that got to do with anything? Plus, God's mind isn't something that exists in his own simulation. It gives rise to the simulation, whereas our minds are something that exists in the simulation alongside our brains. So there's an ontological disparity there. Our brains and minds are both derived from inside the simulation, whereas God's mind is not within the simulation. The simulation is in the mind. So there's a disparity there. And I have failed to see why we would identify any particulars of the simulation with a manifestation of God's mind, or why it would have to be the cosmos or the distribution of galaxies. There's so much ad hoc stuff here. I just don't understand. But anyway, a mere mortal as myself maybe can't comprehend the full elegance of IP's theory. So I'm just going to, let's just grab that and say, all right, sure, you would expect this. I don't understand it at all, but let's move on. So let's actually look at the content of the science, because that's the main point here. So I accuse the authors of the study of cherry-picking their results because the magnification of 40 times samples, or because only the magnification of 40 times of the samples shows a similar distribution. Now, he says that this is not cherry-picking. Why? Because you have to align the correct sizes. This would be like saying it was wrong to say a tardigrade was a caterpillar because you can only see the similarities looking at the right size. If you use a basic magnifying glass, I'd probably see only a dot and not similarity. So he's saying in order to see the language, you need to zoom into the right level. And so there's nothing wrong with using 40 times. Now, I don't think that that's an accurate description there, because the study does not actually show that the web of galaxies looks like the neurons from the cortex. It actually shows that there is a what's the word I'm looking for? That there is a similarity of the power distribution of the modes in the images. It's a particular way. I mean, it's a common way, but it's a particular way of trying to analyze statistically the properties of the images. What it shows is there's that they're sort of similar in that pattern. That's really not analogous to looking at something under the microscope and seeing that it visually resembles something else, because the notion of visual resemblance is it's kind of a vague and fuzzy notion, right? So they've tried to quantify that by looking at the properties of the power distribution or the frequency distribution. It's one of those two. They're similar. And for that, you do need to know what zoom level you're looking at, right? I mean, if you've got infinite degrees of freedom as to what zoom levels you pick, well, then it's going to be much easier to find one that shows that side of resemblance. Again, you're not talking about visual resemblance here. You're just talking about a particular type of statistical resemblance. Now, IP does say here that, now perhaps you would argue by making anything fit by adjusting the magnification or power spectrum scale. Oh yeah, that's shifting it horizontally, which I also mentioned that they do. But this is not true, as they also compared their model against other phenomena. So they compared their model. Here's the graph here. So it's the wave number. And so it's the power spectrum that they look at. Again, this is not a visual resemblance. This is purely the power spectrum. Things can have a similar power spectrum and look completely different visually. So this is not really analogous to the tardigrade caterpillar example, as I said before. Also, they compare it to what? Sky clouds, tree branches, and turbulence and such. So there were some other things that had different power law distributions. Different power spectrum distributions. But that doesn't, I mean, nothing follows from that, whatever. It just means that some things don't have that same pattern. How many other things do, right? And what scale did they look at the clouds or the tree branches? That would have been interesting to know. Could they get a similar pattern if you took different magnifications of the tree branches or different types of trees? We have no context there. All they've told us is that there are a few things that don't show the same pattern. And I'm completely unconvinced by that because I have no basis of what the baseline is of sort of a random set of things that like have a complex structure of this sort at different zoom levels of what their power spectrum would look like. So I don't think that's a good response. So it's not as arbitrary as I imply. I think it is pretty arbitrary because they haven't done a search of similar types of things. They've just presented a few ones. We don't know how they chose those or what zoom levels they looked at, and they have cherry picked the only one that showed the resemblance that they wanted. There's no a priori theoretical reason for picking that. They've just picked it because it fit. And it's not like the zooming in to see the right correspondence things, because this is not a visual correspondence. It's a power spectrum correspondence, which is a very abstract mathematical description. So I don't accept that analogy. If anyone wants to know about the scientific implications, the authors think that they do an interview, which that'd be interesting reading. He says he doesn't care to make any physical implications, which is good because any such implications would be grossly premature and ridiculous. Mostly what I'm doing is focusing on the philosophical implications, and they don't focus on that. So once again, the authors of the study don't agree with the implications that IP is drawing from it, which he does not note. An omission is important there. Okay, so I wanted to mention something else here that IP didn't discuss, which I think is another aspect of why the study is just completely useless for inferring anything that IP wants to, which is that the way that neurons look in the image depends on how they are stained, and there are many different types of staining that you can do. And they will look different depending on the stain that you use. So I wasn't able to find a very quickly, I wasn't able to find a very good comparison of what the different stains look like. I probably could find one if I spent longer looking, but I did want to show a couple of things. Actually, can I just share? Oh dear, that's a lot of windows. Maybe I can just share this whole. Yeah, but seeing if I don't want to do that because. No, I'm not going to risk it. I wanted to try to share a different way, but I think it's going to screw up. So I'm just going to share this. This is a quick list of some different types of staining. So Nissl staining, Luxel fast blue staining, Bodian silver staining, Holzer staining. It doesn't even mention, there's another type that I want to mention here. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There's lots of different staining processes, and it depends on what you want to stain for. The cell body, the neural processes, the myelin, astrocytes, and different aspects of that. This is just all for staining nerve tissue generally. So the point is, what you get depends on how you stain it. Now, that might seem like a trivial point, but let me explain why that's very important here. I don't know the exact stain that was used in that paper. I'd have to dig it up. At least it wasn't easy for me to see it, but yeah, oops, sorry. Okay, now what are we looking at here? Actually, can I make this bigger? I'll just leave it here. So let me zoom in a bit. I want you to be able to see this. Here we go, that's better. On the left here is what tissue actually looks like if you just sort of, well, it says contrast enhanced unstained tissue image of, now this is not actually neural tissue. What type of tissue is this? Or maybe this is neural tissue. Oh no, it's kidney tissue in 3 different stains. Okay, so this is kidney tissue. So this is not literally what neural tissue looks like. But the point being made here, I mean, the cells still look vaguely like, there's dots and lines connecting them basically, but the specifics of the tissue look different. But the point I want to make here is that when you look at tissue under sort of ambient light, it looks like this. It just looks like gray blobs. It doesn't look anything like a galaxy, galaxy clusters. What they do is they cut very thin slices of the tissue, stain particular parts of the tissue, and then visualize that under a microscope. Then you see something that looks more akin. Again, these particular examples don't, because this is not neural tissue, but the point is these look completely different to each other. So why are we saying that staining thin slices of a brain tissue at a particular zoom level and a particular type of stain looks kind of like a galaxy cluster, galaxy clusters, at least according to the a particular way of measuring that similarity. Why on earth is that in any way relevant? Again, because it only looks like this because you've stained it that way, because you're looking at thin slices stained in a particular way under a microscope. When you look at tissue, it looks either like a gray blob or thin slices of it are basically transparent. Like most of it just goes through. You have to stain it to get it to look like anything. And there it depends on, well, what are you staining? Are you staining the nucleus? Are you staining the cell body? Are you staining the dendrites? Are you staining the astrocytes? It depends on what you stain. And it depends on the nature of the stain and how much it stains, or the proportion of neurons and so forth. That's another thing. If you take a slice of tissue that's more than a few, unless it's like one or a couple of cells thick, it's going to be cells stacked on top of each other. So you're going to see just a blob of stuff most of the time, unless it's a very, very thin slice. And typically the stains won't stain all of the neurons, they'll only stain some of them. So that's how you can see anything, because not everything is stained. So the point I'm making here is that the stain that they've selected, the way that it's visualized, the zoom level, all of this is necessary to give them the particular result. It's completely arbitrary. It has no bearing to any real physical relationship. It's just how it looks when you visualize it in a particular way. So this is what I mean when I say that none of this is presented by IP, or it's not presented in the paper either, but I think the paper's bunk as well. And this study is presented as showing more than it does. It shows an interesting visual correspondence of two very specific images constructed in a very specific way. That is of no real scientific interest other than, hey, that's something that's cool. But that is not how IP presents it. And he just doesn't really give any background as to how you can interpret this, which again is the key point. And because of that, I think, again, he misrepresents that the science there. Okay, so that's all fine. I've gone through that. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Now we're moving on to a couple of last points where I talk about some of the quantum mechanics stuff, noting that I did want to finish up pretty soon. So there's a large section here on the Leggett inequality. I think it's not as large as Koch-Becker, but it's largish. So what I want to say about this is that this is an area where I seem to have made an error, because I thought that so there's a couple of points in the video, in his videos, where IP mentions the Leggett inequality, and it also appears on screen. Now, I thought by that he was referring to the Leggett-Garg inequality, but apparently he was referring to the plain old Leggett inequality. Now, confusingly, they are closely related, but they are distinct. I'm not really going to attempt to explain the differences between them here, because what IP was actually appealing to, basically the fact that Bell's and Leggett inequality show that you can't have local realism. That's fine. I agree with that, and I think that is an accurate representation of the science. So I don't have any dispute with that. It's interesting that, because I think that he could well appeal to the Leggett-Garg inequality to make the points that IP wants to make, or at least it's just appealing to that would be no more or less inconsistent with the science than anything else that he appeals to, I guess is the point, particularly when we look later about the Koch-Becker theorem. So that's kind of why I thought he was talking about the Leggett-Garg inequality, because it's closely related to the Leggett inequality. Leggett-Garg inequality basically discusses the implications of hang on. The paper he cites is, what I was going to say is the Leggett-Garg inequality is sort of talks about a broad phenomena of a broad set of phenomena in quantum mechanics, of which Bell's inequality and Leggett inequality are kind of particular cases or instantiations. So they're closely related. So that's why I thought he was talking about it. But I'm quite happy to be corrected there if he was in fact talking about the Leggett inequality, not the Leggett-Garg inequality. So it's talking about macroscopic realism. So that's fine if he doesn't want to appeal to that. Again, I thought he was, because it would seem consistent with some of the other things that he said, particularly the Koch-Becker theorem. But if he didn't, then that's fine, and I stand corrected by misunderstanding which he was referring to. Now, he says here that that is Michael, needs to be more careful in the way he words things so as to not mislead people. Yes, he does. He absolutely does. However, he isn't demonstrating how I'm misrepresenting science. Well, I think I've been making that point. Instead, just pointing out where he disagrees with philosophical interpretations. Well, he does. The problem is that Michael just generally does not distinguish between those two and makes implications and sometimes outright claims, as I've shown in several examples prior to this, that the science straightforwardly does imply his philosophical interpretation. So that's the problem there. Yet here we see him making a scientific error by confusing these inequalities. Look, I don't think that I made a scientific error. I just misunderstood which of the inequalities he was appealing to. I stand corrected. He was appealing to the Leggett inequality, not the Leggett-Garg inequality, though they are related. They are not the same thing. And he was merely trying to say that local hidden variables are not tenable, which is fine. I agree with that. I also confused him there. Yes, because I thought that he was appealing to the Legge-Gargan equality. Needs to point out that James' own stand-up and the importance of not misleading people on what science says. Yeah, well, I didn't mislead anyone about what the science says. I may have misled people about what IP was saying because I misunderstood the what he was appealing to. Again, I think it would have been better for him to appeal to the Legge-Gargan equality, because it's a very interesting well, anyway, I didn't get into all that. I talked about it more in the previous video. So I don't think I misrepresented science, but I was unclear about what IP was talking about there. So I stand corrected, and I'm happy to take that as a correction. Now, Koch-Becker theorem, I think this is the second last one. This one is super long, and I really don't want to get into the details of this because it's very complicated, and I've talked about it at length already in previous videos. So I want to try to focus on the key kind of point here. Oh, geez, this is a really long section here. So he's just describing what this is. I don't think I have too much of a problem with any of this. Okay, in the clip that Michael played, he shows Anton Zeilinger saying that the Koch-Becker theorem shows that what we perceive as reality now depends on our early decision of what to measure. We're not just passive observers. Now, that is sort of true, but again, you have to be very careful. That is a physicist talking in a popular context about the meaning of a very complicated scientific principle. It's a theorem. And that's not even, it's not really false. It's just, you've got to be very careful what that means. I'll try to give a sense of which I think is accurate to what that means. But I think that you can easily misrepresent the science merely by quoting that without giving sufficient context about what it means, particularly if you then place after that a very fringe and unsupported philosophical interpretation. So even if Michael is saying, I'm just quoting the physicist, you can absolutely misrepresent the science just by quoting physicists and then talking about your own personal philosophical implications of that without explicitly and carefully explaining the relationship between the two of them and how one doesn't apply to the other and so forth. So that's one of my big issues here, that he just doesn't really explain the theorem well enough or how it relates to any of the implications he wants to draw from it. The paper is not really helping my case because it's not really attacking anything I put forward. I think it's very unclear exactly what you are arguing about it, which I think is the problem. So here he's going through sort of what he thinks about it. So he doesn't take epistemic views with respect to quantum mechanics, which is fine. In other words, the Koch-Becker theorem points out non-contextuality is incompatible with quantum mechanics. That's true. One can observe a quantum state as a passive observer. That's true. If you mean you don't affect the system, that's correct. How would you measure the term as a final outcome of what we observe? That's true. But again, that can be misleading depending on what you're claiming on the basis of that. Now, I don't actually care about that so much. What do I want to emphasize here? So the thing is, I'm still not really clear as to what he does want to draw out of the Koch-Becker theorem. Everyone agrees that the Koch-Becker theorem says that non-contextual realism, the idea that a quantum state has predefined, previously existing, is in some sort of predefined, previously existing state, which you can then just see it by measuring it, is false. That is false. That can't be true. It's inconsistent with quantum mechanics. Everyone agrees with that. What that means sort of metaphysically, I think, is really kind of unclear. It's not clear to me that it has very strong metaphysical implications, although it might. I need to think about this more. But so here he says, Michael says, I'm not sure how James thinks this is a problem for me because the metaphysical implications of this are exactly what I'm getting at. But it's not clear what the metaphysical implications are. Again, all he said is the classical metaphysical presupposition according to which reality mustn't necessarily be represented in terms of classical ontology as systems with definite pre-existing values is untenable. That's true. We kind of already know that that's not true from quantum mechanics, more generally speaking, right? So I guess you could say that this is a further illustration of that, and rules out non-contextual hidden variable theories. You can still have hidden variables, they just have to be contextual, which means essentially that the way you see them depends on how you interact with the system, to put it crudely. But it's just not clear how much of a metaphysical implication of that. The Koch-Becker theorem makes an ontological claim about the nature of QM. It doesn't really. It makes a claim about the formalism of QM, which is actually quite a specific claim, which he mentions here. It's not something you can test. It's purely a statement about the formalism. How you interpret that is quite another question. Demonstrating there is no reason to think that the pre-existent properties of the quantum state prior to measurement on top of that. Well, no, it doesn't say anything of the sort. What it says is that the quantum mechanics formalism does not allow for the existence of pre-existent as a state having these pre-existent well-defined properties. That can't be under the quantum formalism. It's not an empirical claim about anything. It can't be tested, as he himself notes here, although I can't quite remember where he says that, where IP says that here. But he does note, as I point out, that it's a theorem, it's not something you can test. So I don't agree that that's an implication that it makes any ontological claims at all. It depends how you interpret it. I'm not in either group that the paper defines them. I do not hold to an epistemic view, and I'm not a realist, which leaves me very puzzled as to exactly what he does think about the Koch-Specker theorem. Like, what is the ontology here? I don't really understand what he actually thinks that it says, other than that he says that there's no reason to think that it doesn't say anything about that. It just says that there can't be pre-existent, well-defined state of the quantum system prior to measurement. It's not even about prior to measurement. It's in the absence of a measurement context. It doesn't have that state. That all of those properties are relative to a measurement context, which understood physically would mean the way that the state is interacted with. How you interpret that again is really going to go down to your interpretation of quantum mechanics. Again, I'm going to skip all this because there's a lot of stuff here which I don't know gets to the root of the matter. Philosophical implications of the Koch-Specker theorem are in line with this. Perhaps you get around the measurement problem by positing hidden variables. But this is why I talk about the Koch-Specker theorem after I present experimental violations of Legend inequality, which falsifies realism in quantum mechanics. Well, it doesn't falsify realism in quantum mechanics. You just presented a different theorem showing that the wave function was real. The Legend inequality falsifies local hidden variables theories, not any type of realism in quantum mechanics. Oh, okay. No, but here he's talking about realism claims that all measurement outcomes depend on pre-existing properties of objects that are independent of the measurement. Yeah, so that's like classical. So that's like a classical understanding of reality. Yeah, that's true. But all that means is that whatever reality that there would be to a quantum system, it would have to be contextual. That is, whatever measured properties that you get depend on the way in which the state is interacted with its environment. That is the experimental setup. That's not a falsification of realism. It's just a falsification of that particular brand of realism, which true is we might have thought was correct before quantum mechanics, but we have to abandon given quantum mechanics. But it doesn't falsify any form of realism. You can postulate an unfalsifiable interpretation of QM, but then I'll argue such interpretations are not parsimonious. So here he's talking about his philosophical interpretation of QM, which is fine, but he doesn't really get into this. I mean, there are two videos where he argues against, I think, Bohmian and Everettian interpretations, which is fine, but he doesn't talk about that in any of these videos here that I've been reviewing. That is, he does not clearly say, look, here is what the Koch-Specker theorem shows, and here is how I interpret that on my philosophical theory. That would be clearer, and I think the right way to do it. Instead, he just muddles them together by implying that the Koch-Specker theorem has any ontological implications, which again, I contend it does not. Have a look at the papers that I reference in the video where I talk more about this. It's a purely formal result of the formalism of quantum mechanics. What that means ontologically is going to depend on how you interpret the formalism, and we're right back to interpretations of quantum mechanics. Maybe I'll even do a whole nother video just on the Koch-Specker theorem because it's so complicated. I really don't want to get into the weeds there now. I was going to talk a bit more about it, but I don't think I will because it's too hard to explain. And I'm still getting my head around all the nuances there because it is hard. But the point is that I don't quite understand here when he says that these different theories are unfalsifiable, because how is his view falsifiable? It's not even clear what his view is. I don't even know what IP's view is. It's some sort of consciousness causes collapse, but because he's also like a theistic idealist, I don't really know how that, because God's mind doesn't collapse a wave function, but our minds do. I don't really know how that works. Has anyone developed a theory of quantum mechanics? Like, has anyone published on that theory? I'll come back to this later, but I don't even think he can appeal to anyone who's published on this particular interpretation. I think it's entirely idiosyncratic, which is partly why it's so hard to understand what he's saying here. Anyway, so maybe they're not parsimonious or and they have problems. But again, how does that compare to Michael's theory? What is the theory that Michael is advocating? How does it compare to these theories? How does it compare in parsimony? Can it be falsified? We don't have any answers to these questions. So I don't think that this is a very good response here. Now, I'm right, the Koch-Specker theorem can never be tested. This is what I was saying before. It's not an empirical result. It does not have any direct ontological implications. It's a purely formal result. It might have ontological implications, but that depends on how you interpret the formalism. If you're a realist about quantum mechanics, then it shows that you can't have a state that has the quantum states cannot have predefined properties that exist prior to measurement outside of the context. If you're a realist about quantum systems, that's what it says. But even that, well, what does that mean exactly depends on further interpretive questions. Yeah, this is actually quite good, this quote here from the paper. In QM, to measure all properties of the same quantum system, one necessarily requires mutually incompatible measurement setups. This imposes the necessity of a repeated series of measurements, but is it possible to measure the same quantum system repeatedly? The answer is no. So that is, you can't really test it, because the whole point is that if you do one test, then that changes the system. You don't have the same system anymore. That's sort of the point of it. So you can't really test this. It's purely an application of the formalism of quantum mechanics, that the operators don't commute, is the technical term, and so that a single measurement context will be a commuting series of a set of operators, and the properties that you get out of it depend on which of those commuting sets of operators you pick. But that's a purely formal result. You can't test that. What ontological or metaphysical implications it has depend on how you interpret quantum theory. That's what I've said here. You can't define all the properties of a quantum system with respect to certain types of measurements at the same time because of interference between different aspects of the quantum system. It's maybe a bit more than just interference, but that's, I think, basically correct. Again, this is maybe not the best way to say it, but I'm doing my best here. Now, but then what does he say about this? The question becomes, what evidence is there for properties of a quantum system were prior to the measurement? Well, we can't really say much about that because we can't measure them. You can only make postulates about that, and that's going to depend on your interpretations of quantum mechanics. Any falsifiable hidden variable theory has been ruled out by violations of Legate equality. Yeah, so there aren't falsifiable differences between the main interpretations of quantum theories at the moment. That doesn't mean that we can't adhere to them. It just means they're not falsifiable, and so they're more in the lane of philosophy than in physics. So that's fine. I don't have an issue with that. Again, Michael's theory is not clear and probably not falsifiable either. Until we get more details on it, it's hard to say. In its complete form, ontological form can then be understood as an ad absurdum proof of the untenability of the classical metaphysical presupposition according to which reality must necessarily be represented in terms of classical ontology, namely as systems with definite valued pre-existent properties. This is what I'm saying. If you interpret quantum mechanics as a realist theory, then the Koch-Becker theorem implies that you can't have quantum systems as with definite pre-existent properties. That's true. What does that mean? Does that mean that the real world doesn't exist? Or, well, no, it doesn't. It's not clear what that means. It just means you can't have classical ontology. You can't have systems with definite value pre-existent properties. So, okay, what follows from that that would support Michael's view? I don't actually understand. This is what I mean. I don't know what he's arguing for in discussing quantum contextuality here, because I just don't understand what he wants to draw out of that claim there. It appears with the use of the quote from what was his name? Bugger, right now I can't find it. The physicist he quoted, right? It's Anton Zellinger. That's right. What we perceive as reality now depends on our early decision of what to measure. We're not passive observers. That sounds like it's something like consciousness causes collapse kind of stuff. And I contend that in his videos, Michael presents it as if the Koch-Becker theorem supports those sorts of interpretations. I contend that it offers no support for those interpretations because it doesn't say anything about that. All it says is that you can't have these type of classical properties. Again, you can't have, if you interpret quantum mechanics realistically, which IP said he doesn't, so I'm still confused. But anyway, you can't have systems with definite value pre-existent properties. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything about whether consciousness causes collapse or anything else. The connection there is that obviously an observer setting up an experimental apparatus will determine which of the quantum property or the way in which they measure the quantum system, and therefore the set of operators that they're applying to the system, according to a particular interpretation of the relationship between those, of course. So that's the way in which observers affect the quantum system, because they place it in a physical apparatus which causes certain aspects of the system to be manifest, if you want to put it that way. But it's not any sort of consciousness causes collapse or anything like that. So you've got to be really careful about what is meant here. And I think that is what Michael is appealing to, that lack of clarity about what it means by we're not passive observers when he's appealing to the Koch-Becker theorem. If it's more than that, then I've failed to work out what it is that Michael is trying to appeal to from this theorem here. Other than that, we know that he doesn't agree with any of the other interpretations of quantum mechanics, but he doesn't really offer what clearly the alternative is supposed to be. If the formalism doesn't allow for pre-existing properties and non-local hidden variables are ruled out by Legate inequality, then we have a pretty good case for an... Okay, so this is what I mean. Why do we have a good case for an objective idealist? All we know is that we can't have non-contextual pre-existent properties and we can't have non-local hidden variables. So if there is an underlying physical reality, it must be contextual and non-local. Even that is contested because it depends on a few different things, but such as a realist interpretation of this. But okay, so if it's contextual and non-local, that's very interesting because it conflicts with our typical intuitions about this sort of stuff. But there's nothing like, well, so what? It just means that reality was different to how we thought. It doesn't mean that idealism is true. How does that follow? And again, this is how he's misrepresenting the science. IP seems to be making the step pretty readily from non-locality and non-locality and contextuality to idealism, without drawing that gap, without explaining how that gap is to be connected, and without even clearly articulating this conceptual space and explaining these things to his audience there. So I think he really is misrepresenting the science here, as well as being very unclear about what he's even saying philosophically here. James says this doesn't mean we create reality. It is not my position we will reality to existence, like we create reality, but the emergence of the physical properties does depend on observation under idealism. I don't know what that means, so I'm just going to leave that. That's not a scientific claim anyway. It's not like we choose what to see, but how we measure determines what the physical outcomes will be, and the evidence supports this conclusion. Yes, because how you measure, the only way we measure things is to set up a particular physical apparatus in a particular configuration. That is describable in the language of quantum mechanics by the application of particular operators on the Hilbert space of the quantum state, which then will allow you to measure a particular set of properties. Depending on which set of commuting operators you choose, that will be the context in the sense of quantum contextuality that you are measuring the system. And you can't get, so there's apparently, according to Kökes-Becker theorem, if you interpret it realistically, no way in which you can assign a consistent set of pre-existent properties that will allow you to recover all of the different ways that you can interact with the system via these operators as manifested physically by the experimental apparatus. So that is what the Kökes-Becker theorem says. It doesn't say anything about us shaping reality. It is the way the quantum system interacts with the rest of reality which shapes what we see. And that is in no way surprising, at least at the broad level. The specifics are quite interesting. That it turns out that the classical way of thinking about this doesn't work. But much of this actually, for those of you who are interested, much of this actually fundamentally goes to the fact that quantum mechanical operators are non-commutative, which means that the order of them matters. If I add 2 and 3 or 3 and 2, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. But that's not true quantum mechanically. The order of the thing at which you perform operations matters. And that's why that you can't actually define a set of properties that pre-exists in any and that is recoverable in any application of the different operators or experimental situation, because the order matters. That's a loose way to understand this. So it is interesting, but it's not like I just don't see how it has any connection to idealism, and so I don't think that the evidence supports the conclusion that how we measure things determines the physical outcome in the idealist sense that he seems to be implying. And I think he's misleading to imply that it does, and to present quotes from physicists that again imply that the physicists agree with him, because they don't. Of course, one can falsify this idea, but just showing that the quantum system has those properties prior to measurement. Well, no, it can't have those properties prior to measurement. That's the whole point, at least if you interpret the quantum mechanics realistically. But it doesn't mean that it can't have any properties prior to measurement. They just must be contextual properties. So it means you can't have a classical understanding of a quantum system. It doesn't mean that it can't exist. It doesn't mean it has to be idealism. Again, how does that follow? It is not like looking at a classical object and just seeing it from different angles. That is true. I think I may have given that analogy. It's not a very good one, but you know, if you're trying to make someone understand, that might be the best. That's somewhere to start from, right? Seeing you look at something from different views, you see it differently. But the problem is that the view still pre-exists you looking at it, which isn't true quantum mechanically. So there's no perfect way to make this analogy. Anyway, the Kökes-Becker theorem makes explicit the ontological compatibility between properties. So I don't agree with that, because in the sense that you can't just read an ontology off of a formal system. You have to also have an interpretive framework for providing that. And that I think is premature, because we don't have one and it's contested. There's no evidence the properties are there, and we are just able to see one aspect of them. Yeah, I agree that the different angles thing may have been somewhat misleading, but it's very hard to explain this in a way that's not just completely technical. The point there is I'm not claiming that the properties pre-exist and or anything of the sort, because if you interpret quantum mechanics in a realist way, the Kökes-Becker theorem rules that out. What I want to ask is, how does Michael go from that, the fact that any systems that exist in quantum mechanics interpreted realistically must be non-local and contextual according to the theorems that he's putting forward. How do you go from that to idealism being true? I completely fail to see the connection. And furthermore, more directly relevant to this point, IP does not explain the leap that he's making there, or the inference that he's making there between the science and the philosophical implications. He presents it all as one thing, and he adds quotes in from the physicists, such as those that I mentioned before, to try to give the flavor or imply that they agree with what he's saying, even though that they don't. And therefore, he, I think, is misrepresenting the science there. I was just wondering if I wanted to play any part of the video where he mentions the Kökens-Becker theorem, but it's even vaguer than many of his other implications about what exactly is supposed to follow from it, which I think is the problem here, because whatever I say he's saying, he's going to deny that he said it. All right, there's a little bit here that I'll just show where the Zellinger here makes that quote. So we'll see how he presents this. Just to finish this out. And then we'll talk a little bit about delayed choice quantum razor, and then we're done. We're nearly finished here. Okay, so again, I'm just going to show a bit of this video as to how he, oh bugger, which one was it? I think it's this one. How he presents the Kökens-Becker theorem in the videos.
Constantly observing it, we in fact create reality.
And then on top of this, the Cognition theorem was experimentally confirmed in 2011. The philosophical implications also support the notion physical reality is not there without an observer, as Anton Zellinger explains.
The Cognition-Becker theorem talks about properties of one system only. So we know that we cannot assume, to put it precisely, we know that it is wrong to assume that the features of a system which we observe in the measurement exist prior to the measurement. Not always, I mean in certain cases. So in a sense, what we perceive as reality now depends on our earlier decision what to measure, which is a very, very deep message about the nature of reality and about our role in the universe. We are not just passive observers.
In other words, the Cognition-Becker theorem confirms the notion of reality is dependent on observation. You can't separate observers from reality, like the idea of watching nature play out on a stage. Our actions now very much determine the results, especially the collapse of the wave function and the existence of particles in their physical form. This only correlates with the conclusions of this study, which shows objectivity, determinism, and independence combined are incompatible with any theory about the universe, and not only with quantum mechanics, but with classical approaches as well. In other words, you can't have a universe that is objective, deterministic, and also independent from observers, as we once thought. All the data has confirmed this through multiple experiments, that reality is dependent on observers, whether it is the interaction-free.
All right, I think that makes the point. So he's talking about dependence on observers. Notice that Zellinger there said that in a sense, it shows that reality depends on what we choose to measure. And I think he's being a lot more careful than a lot of physicists, because that is in a sense. You've got to understand what he means there. And again, to not belabor the point, what he means is that in quantum mechanics, measurements are described as application of operators on states in Hilbert space. Some of those operators you can apply sort of at the same time to the same system, and others you can't. A set of operators that you can apply to the same system without sort of fundamentally changing it are commuting operators. A bunch of those form a context. You pick one of those contexts and you can measure a bunch of properties of a system. But if you pick a different context and apply that to the same system, that is measure a bunch of different things, then you get different properties. And the system, it turns out that it's impossible for the system to have a set of pre-existent properties that is consistent with all of the different things you could observe in any of the contexts that you pick. That is the sense in which what you get, what the system is is dependent on what you choose to measure. But it means that is a purely formal result, which if you interpret it in a particular way, means that, yeah, there will be no non-contextual, there'll be no non-contextual, that is classically objective properties of the system. All it means, therefore, is that properties of a system, if you interpret the theory in a certain way, must be contextual, which is interesting, but doesn't mean that it is not real. And very importantly, contrary to what IP has just said here, it doesn't have anything to do with the existence of observers. This is a purely formal result about the format of the formal operation of the system. This would be true even if there were no observers in the universe. The formalism, I mean, you could ask where would the formalism come from if we hadn't come up with it, but the formalism, in so much as it would apply to the system, in so much as it would still describe the same system, this would still be true even if there were no observers. So, there's no part of the formalism here that says that observers have to play any role. It's about the application of these abstract operators on quantum systems in Hilbert space, which mean that you can't sort of get all of the aspects of the system with the same set of operators at the same time, and therefore what you get depends on the context you choose to measure it in. And that can be in the formal space, or again, if you interpret the theory as applying to the physical reality in a direct way, that will then have the implication that the way the properties that you measure from the system depend on the experimental setup that you've constructed. But again, you don't have to have conscious observers for that to be true. nature could just have these set up. So when there's a particular way that particles interact with each other, it's purely natural. That's a context as well. It's just nature selecting the context via the way the physical particles interact. There is no part of the formalism or the Koch-Becker theorem that says anything about the existence of observers, conscious or otherwise, right? So this is, again, a gross misrepresentation of what the theorem says, and a misrepresentation of what the scientists, well, this scientist in particular, and what others are saying. And IP just has not given sufficient context for viewers to understand this and to understand the relationship between the theorem, the experiments, and IP's preferred interpretation of the theorem. And I'll add his preferred interpretation is extremely unclear, because he seems to reject all possibilities, but doesn't give any clear example of who is articulating a theory that he would agree with, or what that would look like. But that's another point for another day. All right, we're finally on to the last topic here. Let me just reshare. It's gone a bit longer than I wanted, but that's the nature of things. But we have covered quite a lot. Delayed choice quantum eraser. Okay, James opened this section by noting that my interpretation of quantum mechanics there is consistent with the results of delayed choice quantum eraser, which it is, because any theory of, well, as far as I know it is, although his interpretation is a bit unclear, because sort of I generally understand IP to have a consciousness causes collapse interpretation of quantum mechanics, but he seems to disagree with that in some other points above. So I'm still a bit confused, but we didn't get into that here. He doesn't show any place where I misrepresent the actual science. Well, in saying that consciousness causes collapse, that's not a misrepresentation of the science, but we'll get to later where I think he does misrepresent the science in implying that the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment provides evidence for consciousness causing collapse, which it does not. There is a big difference between saying your interpretation is consistent with the science and saying that the science supports your interpretation, and that is where IP goes wrong and I think misrepresents the science. So we'll get to that in a moment. He says one is not required to hold the view that consciousness causes collapse. I agree, and I never said otherwise when arguing for my interpretation. Oh, well, we'll get to that in a moment. I argued in my video my conclusions are the most parsimonious and plausible interpretation, and given the combination of all the data I argue for. All right, well, before we get to, we see there's a lot more detail on this here. All right, I think I do need to show this, though, to make the point. So let me just show a little bit of one of his videos here. Again, so you can see the context of what he's arguing for here. I hope I get the right one. Oh, yeah, let's do this one here. So he's talking about the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment here. I don't want to go through all the details here, because I'll get to that in a moment. What I want is, what does he say about what we can infer from this experiment?
The past by loading up a back history to correlate with our knowledge. John Wheeler said, it begins to look as if we ourselves, by a last-minute decision, have an influence on what a photon will do when it has already accomplished most of its doing. We have to say that we ourselves have an undeniable part in shaping what we have always called the past. The past is not really the past until it has been registered. Or put it another way, the past has no meaning or existence unless it exists as a record in the present. An experiment from 2012 took this a step further and brought back in the conscious free will of the observer. To understand this experiment, picture two entangled photons are sent from either station A or
I don't want to go through the particulars of the experiment, but notice he did mention conscious free will, which is not a part of any of this. But
if we attempt to attribute an objective meaning to the quantum state of a single system, curious paradoxes appear. Quantum effects mimic not only instantaneous actions at a distance, but also, as seen here, influence of future actions on past events, even after these events have been irrevocably recorded. John Wheeler's original thought experiment shows the implications of this. He explains by asking us to imagine a distant star that emits a photon billions of years ago and sends it towards Earth. However, on the way, it must pass a dense galaxy. Gravitational lensing will make the light bend around the galaxy, so the photon can take one of two paths around the galaxy. Billions of years later, upon reaching Earth, an astronomer chooses to use a screen type of light projector that encompasses both sides of the surrounding space, without focusing on a specific region. Therefore, the photon will land somewhere along the field of focus, without anyone being able to tell which side it took. So it will display an interference pattern, demonstrating it took both. However, the astronomer could choose to measure the incoming photon with a binocular apparatus and focus on the left side of the galaxy, while the other side focuses on the right side. In this second case, how the astronomer chose to measure means the photon could have only taken one path and would display a clump pattern. So in this thought experiment, how we choose to measure now affects how the photon acted billions of years ago. Our choice affects how the particle acted in the past. So the factor of time has nothing to do with quantum mechanics. And the interesting thing about this is, John Wheeler based this on the mathematics of quantum mechanics. Mathematically, this is what was predicted, and the exact same result is what we see when we put it to experimental test.
Yeah, that didn't have as clear an ending as I'd hoped it would. However, he does mention quite a number of times the role of conscious observers, and this is consistent elsewhere with in other videos where he also talks about the delayed choice quantum eraser and also the double slit experiments. So the point there is that it is clear that he is drawing implications on the basis of these experiments, showing that the these experimental results provide evidence for the role of a conscious observer. I just think that's undeniable if you watch what he said about that. I'm pretty sure he appeals to this in other videos as well. I'm just can't find exactly where that is. This is a discussion of just the double slit, but I think that example was sort of sufficient by itself. I'm just having a quick look at one other one. I think that'll do for the moment. All right, so let me bring back the keeps moving these tabs. It's really annoying. Let me bring back the blog post. Okay, so I think that IP is misrepresenting the evidence insofar as he is presenting the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment as evidence for the role of conscious observers, or any sort of observers really, in quantum phenomena, because it doesn't support that. It may be consistent with that, but doesn't support it. So let's see, what else do I wanted to say about this? All right, there's a point that he makes here, which is kind of interesting. James says my view is a minority position. So again, I'm taking his view to be that consciousness causes collapse. I want to address this because James has made the remark in multiple hangouts, and I don't think he's presenting the full picture. He has stated, I've stated that I hold to objective collapse interpretation, which is actually a minor view and appears even more of a minority view than mine. See the results here. Wait, is this from that? I just realized that there's a link here. But I'm pretty sure that figure is taken from this paper. I actually want to double check that because I don't want to get this wrong. There have been very few surveys that have been done about physicists' attitudes to interpretations of quantum mechanics. This is one of the few that have been done. It was a conference of quantum foundations a few years ago, I believe. And you can see the results here. The majority of views were either for no interpretation or Copenhagen interpretation, which I would contend is basically not an interpretation, a sort of refusal to interpret, if you like. Yeah, this is from the same paper that I had in mind. So that figure is from this paper that he links to there. Anyway, but so what do other people have to say who do have an interpretation? Well, there's a consistent histories, couple of de Broglie-Bohm, some many worlds, some information theoretical ones, modal. I don't even really know what that is. Objective collapse. So that's the one that I kind of prefer. A couple of those. 1% I think is about one person. Quantum Bayesianism, statistical interpretation, no transactionals, and a few other. So first note that the view that I have said that I lean to which is the objective collapse view, is certainly a minority here, although all of the views are a minority, except for those that really aren't views, which are Copenhagen and no preferred interpretation. So yeah, I'm happy to say that it's a minority view, but further question here, what is IP's preferred view? If it's consciousness causes collapse, then I don't see it mentioned there. None of these views are that. It's also called the von Neumann interpretation, but it's not here by that name either. So I don't quite understand how this data is supposed to support the idea that my view is more fringe than his. Now, I will also want to show that I'm not just appealing to a fringe theory here, even if physicists don't necessarily. I mean, as you can see, these results clearly show physicists mostly don't think about the foundations of quantum mechanics, because mostly they don't interpret it, or at least they don't buy into any of these interpretations. Okay, this book here by Tim Maudlin, Philosophy of Physics, Quantum Theory, talks about some of the main interpretations. After some background, the main theories that it discusses are pilot wave theories, which correspond. I realize it's a bit hard to see this figure here. Oh, bugger. Hopefully that's a bit easier. So it discusses pilot wave theories, which corresponds to de Broglie-Bohm interpretation there. It discusses many worlds interpretations, which is Everettian. And it discusses objective collapse theories, which is this one here. So those are sort of some of the three main ones that get discussed in these sort of treatments. Now, there's another book that I have a PDF copy of called Foundations of Quantum Mechanics by Travis Norson. It is also a very interesting text discussing similar issues here. Let's look at its table of contents, again, after some initial discussions. What are the theories that it looks at? The Copenhagen interpretation, pilot wave theory, so that's de Bohm-Roy again, spontaneous collapse theory, and many worlds theories. That's the Everettian theory. So it's the same ones again. They just also discuss the Copenhagen interpretation there. What about the Standard Encyclopedia Philosophy article on philosophical issues in quantum theory with respect to, what do I want to look at? With respect to approaches to the measurement problem, which is one of the main issues that these theories attempt to describe. So there's non-realist approaches, So those would include like informational or quantum Bayesian approaches. Both IAP and I tend to reject those. Then there's hidden variables. So that would include the de Broglie theory, the pilot wave theories. Note that there's a little bit here that we can actually appeal to. This is the Koch-Becker theorem here. Does not rule out hidden variable theories per court, which I think means overall. The simplest way to circumvent this is to pick an always definite some observable or compatible set of variables that suffices to guarantee determined outcomes of experiments. Other observables are not signed definitive values in experiments. Thought of measurements of these observables do not reveal pre-existing values. So the point is, you need contextual hidden variables there. So that's just referring back to what we talked about before about what does the Koch-Becker theorem mean metaphysically? Unclear, because you can interpret it different ways, just like all this stuff. So anyway, so there's Bohm-Mima and also modal interpretations there. Dynamical collapse theory. So those are the ones that I lean to. There's the Everettian many worlds theories. And there's a few others briefly mentioned, like relational quantum mechanics here. And that seems to be it. There's a mention of consistent history. That's a slightly different one. We only have a very brief mention of the role of conscious observers here. And what does it say here? None of the mainstream approaches accord any special physical role to conscious observers. There have, however, been proposals in that direction. See the entry on quantum approaches to consciousness, which is the whole separate discussion. So obviously there are some people who've discussed this. It talks here about quantum mind, and I think there's some discussion of quantum brain, quantum mind, which is some of the other stuff that IP appeals to. The point there, though, I just appeal to 3 different scholarly works, all of which discuss as some of the mainstream interpretations would be Copenhagen, dynamical collapse or objective collapse theory, pilot wave / de Broglie, and the Everettian. Those are some of the big ones that get discussed in these foundations discussions. There's nothing fringe about any of those views. They're all pretty widely discussed, even if many physicists don't necessarily accept them themselves. If anything is fringe, it's the view that there is a privileged role for conscious observers in anything to do with a privileged physical role here, because as this Stanford Encyclopedia clearly pointed out, none of the main interpretations require that or postulate that. And that theory is not even mentioned or discussed. I should say it's not discussed. I don't know if I don't think it's mentioned at all in this book. I don't know if it's mentioned in the other one because I haven't read it yet. But the point is that I am not advocating for a fringe view in the sense that it is not widely discussed or put forward in the philosophical literature on this. The only theory that could be described in that category would be whatever it is that Michael is putting forward, which is some sort of privileged role of observers. But even that is non-standard because he's also a theistic idealist. So I don't even know how you reconcile that together, because for some reason God is a mind that doesn't collapse a wave function, but we are minds within God's mind that do collapse a wave function. Who on earth is publishing a theory that tries to explain how all that works? I've never seen anything of that sort. I'd be very interested if there are people in the literature trying to make this work, because that would be very interesting just to see how they can fit it together. So I think that claim that I'm proposing a fringe theory, whereas Michael isn't, is just not feasible there. All right, so let's move beyond that point there. Here's the diagram of the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. I apologize if it's a little unclear because I'm using the dark background, but so my eyes don't bore through my skull with all the light. Now, there's one or two more points I wanted to make here, because again, I think I've explained how Michael misrepresents the implications of this, because this experiment has in no way supports the role of conscious observers as having a particular physical role in these experiments. Now, he says I could do a good job explaining it, which is fine. That's I tried to be clear about it. Now, there's some stuff he says that I don't want to emphasize here, because there's a clear part here that I want to focus on. Here it is. James' interpretation at this part of my video seems to be that when a photon hits D0, which is the basically camera here, we'll call that a camera, which detects photons that come straight from the source. So again, if you don't know anything about this, it's probably best to watch my video first, because I'm not going to explain it again here. But the very short version is that there's a laser that shoots out a photon that goes through one, or that may go through one or may go through both slits, and then is duplicated by this prism here. One of the entangled photons goes straight to a detector, well, through a lens and then straight to a detector. The other one goes through a complicated apparatus which can essentially either detect it in a way where it can tell which slit it went through, which is this one here and this one here. Notice that only white lines go to D3 here, which means that they only came from this slit, or D4 here, only red lines go to this, which means it can tell that the photon came from that slit, or it can detect it in a way where it doesn't know which slit it came from. Notice here that white and red lines go to D1 and D2. So here you do not know which slit the photon came from. So at D1 and D2, you'll see an interference pattern because you've got photons from both slits. D3 and D4, you do not, because you know which slit it came for, and therefore it only passed through one slit. Now, this one here, D0, the photons always come straight from the lens. So there's no bouncing around in this part of the system. So why is that important? Well, because IP is saying that, where are we here? Yeah, so I have claimed that when a photon hits D0, it randomly collapses to a wave or particle. Well, no, it collapses to a particle because it's observed at a particular point on the detector. But the point is, the collapse, what I'm saying is, if you measure this first, the collapse here determines the collapse at this part of the system. That's the claim. Alternatively, if you measure this first, then that determines the collapse here. That's an interpretation of this. It's a standard interpretation, as I discussed in my previous video. Now, IP doesn't like that. Why? The problem with this is that the particles that hit D0, this top one that comes straight from the prism, have the same path information every time. So there is no reason for the particle to randomly collapse to a wave or particle and thereby affect its twin's later path. So that doesn't make any sense, because this D0 here never has which path information. You can see that clearly because red lines and yellow and white lines both go to D0, which means that there is no way to tell which slit the photon went through at D0. You cannot tell that from D0. The only way you can tell that is at D3 and D4. And then what you can do is you can correlate that with measurements made at D0, but only after the fact. What you can do is basically say, okay, for every time that I measured a photon at D3, where did I measure photons at D0? And you can produce an after the fact interference pattern at D0, but only by ignoring all the times where you measured at D4. So basically what you get at D0 is two interference patterns that are superimposed on each other, so you don't see an interference pattern because they're on top of each other, offset by 180 degrees. Only after the fact can you extract out the white ones or the red ones by correlating them and then observe an interference pattern there. So the point there is that by looking at D0 itself and not anything else, you never have which path information, because again, photons from both slits go to this D0, so you don't know which slit it went through. So it doesn't make sense here when he says the problem is that particles that hit D0 have the same path information every time. They have no which path information each time, and that's precisely the point. They collapse. So when a photon from here is detected at this D0 here, then an interpretation of what's happening is it then determines which of the detectors, so like D3 or at D1 or whatever. Sorry, no, not at D3 or D4. It determines which of those two detectors it appears at. There's nothing inconsistent about that interpretation there, and it's not because this has there is which path information at D0. It's precisely because you don't have that information at D0. So if the point I'm trying to make here is that if I measure a particle appearing at D0, just by looking at that particle, or that spark that's made on the camera or whatever, I can't tell whether the photon came from the white or the red slit. There's no way to tell that just by looking at D0. I can tell later on by looking at D3 which it came through by correlating a bunch of measurements, but I can't just by looking at D0. So there's no inconsistency here. Where it hits at D0 can determine whether it's going to hit at D3 or D4, but I won't be able to know that until I go back and look afterwards and correlate the two, because there's no interference pattern observed at D0 by itself. So there's no reason for the particle to randomly collapse to a wave or particle and thereby affect its twin's later path. I mean, it does. That's the way it works, at least according to this interpretation, which is a fairly standard interpretation. So I just don't see the problem here. For example, this would be inconsistent with the result from standard double slit experiments, where depending on the experimental setup, we get the same result every time. Yeah, but in that case, I don't even understand what the point being made there is. In that case, we don't have this setup where they're going to different locations. There's only one screen there, so I don't understand the point being made there. We do not get a switching between these two results in one experiment unless we modify how we measure the photons. Well, the point is, in a single slit experiment, again, you can't tell which slit the photon went through just by looking at any of the particular measurements. That's consistent with the results here. The only way you can get an interference pattern at D0 is by looking at it after the fact, by correlating the detections, say, measured at D3 with the same detections at D0. So basically I say, all of the times that I measured it at D3, where did I measure a particle here? And you will see, if you just pick those ones, that there's an interference pattern. But if you look at all of the times that photons hit D0, you won't see an interference pattern. That's the difference between the two experiments. There's a way of essentially separating out the information. So to put it another way, The only way we can get which path information is to destroy the interference pattern. You can get the interference pattern back by extracting that particular set of the sort of one half of it from the full set of data. But you've still destroyed the interference pattern by looking at D0 alone by detecting which slit it went through at D3 or D4 here. So the fact that the experimental setup is different is exactly why you don't see the interference pattern here, but you do in the standard double slit experiment. Anyway, I feel like I may be losing people here, but I think I've made my point here. I think IP is just not being clear in the way he's explaining this and is mispresenting the situation here. There's nothing wrong with the standard interpretation of this experiment. IP is, if he wants to, completely at liberty to interpret it differently and say that consciousness must cause this collapse, but the experiment itself does not in any way support that interpretation, nor is that implied by the experiment in any way. Is there anything else I want to say about this? I don't think there's anything else I wanted to say there. Observer means detection by a physical apparatus. So that's, again, the standard. That's what observation means in quantum mechanics. Any standard reputable text that you look at that will define it that way. It has no implications of a consciousness or anything like that. How we observe is through an apparatus, but that alone doesn't tell us why the results are different. The which path information does that, and that has nothing to do with merely interacting with a measuring apparatus. If it was just detection by a physical apparatus, why is the path to that apparatus causing a different result? See, the fact that he asked that question seems to show to me that he doesn't understand this at all. Okay, so the reason you get a different result in this experiment compared to the standard double slit experiment, where you don't have any of this apparatus, is because this apparatus provides a way for the system to interact in such a way that it can tell whether this, say, the white photons went through this slit and the red photons went through this slit. If you don't, if I delete D3 and D4 and I've only got D1 and D2, I don't get which path information. And so I can't tell which slit they went through. So the fact that they are physically interacting in a different way is why we see different results. This isn't a fundamentally, I mean, the setup is a bit confusing. The fundamental idea, though, if I set up a physical system differently, you will measure different results from the quantum interactions that occur in that different physical system. I don't think that's that hard to understand. And that's all that's being claimed here. When you set up the system such that you can tell, you are able to tell which, maybe I shouldn't phrase it that way because that implies an observer. When you set up the system such that photons from only one of the slits fall on one detector and photons from only one of the other slits fall on another detector, that changes the interference pattern observed at D0. Namely, it eliminates it. It removes the interference pattern at D0, unless you go back afterwards and correlate the measurements observed at D3 with where you measured them at D0, and likewise for red, and then you will see the interference patterns. But you destroy them by setting up the system in a way where only photons from one slit can interact with D3 and only those from the other slit can interact with D4. So the physical setup of the system in a different way to the standard double slit experiment, which doesn't have this apparatus there, is what causes the different results. It's nothing to do with a conscious observer. I make this clear when I refer to the papers. I think I said a couple of papers where I walk through the double slit experiment in my previous video, so you can also refer to that if you're interested in more. The Wikipedia page is also quite good on this, so you can refer to that. That's where this diagram comes from. So, I mean, he's just wrong here. There's nothing that's unexplained by standard quantum theory here, other than, of course, how you interpret it. But the point is that there's nothing that requires us to postulate a conscious observer. You can if you like, but the delayed choice quantum eraser double slit experiment does not in any way require that or imply that. And if he seems to think that you need that to explain anything here, then that is just flatly wrong and is a misrepresentation of the science. The moment you can throw away one possibility and keep the other is when you finally become conscious of the fact the experiment has one result. You see the quantum mechanical descriptions in terms of knowledge, and knowledge requires somebody who knows. So this is, I believe, Davies and Brown. I'm pretty sure that's another popular science book which is articulating a particular. What happened there? Oh, here it is. Yeah, The Ghost in the Atom. So that's one of these books I mentioned. That's, I think, one of the pretty lousy quantum mysticism type books that well, certain people like to appeal to. But anyway, that might be their view. I don't agree with that. And anyway, that is an interpretation of the quantum mechanics. It's nothing that's implied by the theory or the experiment results directly. So in my view, this is a far more parsimonious understanding of what is going on. I mean, he can hold that, but he presents in his videos as if that the experimental results imply that, which is a misrepresentation of the science. Now, I never argue from this experiment alone, but from multiple areas. Yes, but if all of those, or the majority of them, show a misrepresentation of the science and fail to distinguish between the actual scientific results and the philosophical implications that are drawn from those, then it's a misrepresentation of the science. And the fact that you've got a lot of them doesn't in any way make it better. My interpretation can explain a lot more with a lot less. I mean, I disagree, but that's outside the science, make it more plausible. I can explain all these various data points with one idealistic interpretation instead of different independent explanation for each issue. I actually have no idea how one idealistic interpretation explains any of these things. If idealism is true, why do you expect the results of the delay choice quantum radius experiment? Why do you expect quantum contextuality? Why do you expect entanglement? Why do you expect non-locality? Why do you expect the cosmic universe to look like a brain? Why do you expect space-time to be emergent? Like, why are any of those things expected under idealism? I haven't the foggiest idea. Now, that itself is not misrepresentation of the science. That's just, I don't agree with the fact that that's a good explanation. But I certainly think that he hasn't presented that argument clearly in any of the videos that I've seen. So at any rate, let's quickly look at the conclusion and then do a bit of summary. So we're wrapping up here. I don't think it's fair for James to title the video "How Inspired Philosophy Misrepresents Science" when all I did was explain how I have different philosophical interpretations. Not true, because I explained many areas where IP misrepresents, that is, inaccurately, incorrectly, misleadingly represents what the scientists are saying and what the empirical results or theoretical results imply. So although I did talk about some of the aspects where I have different philosophical interpretations, for the most part here and in that video, I didn't talk about that. I mostly talked about how the science is not accurately represented in his videos, and I stand by that. More importantly, if you're going to accuse me of getting the science wrong, I mean, I guess it's an accusation, but I mean, it's not really whether he gets it wrong or not. See, that language seems to imply that he's taking it personally. It's not whether about he gets the science wrong. It's about whether I mean, yeah, he made the videos, right? But whether the material that he puts out, particularly his videos, accurately represent the science in a way that the viewers will understand and take away the correct understanding of it, or whether one's done a good job in doing that. And I don't think he does. And in that sense, he has misrepresented the science. Again, I don't intend this as a personal attack. It's just it's a criticism of the way he represents his ideas and the way he's represented them or presented them. Anyway, if you're going to do that, you better do a job to get the science right. And at times, James made scientific errors. So I believe the only one that I made was it was not actually a scientific error, but it was just in misunderstanding what IP was saying when he was referring to the Leggett inequality. I thought he meant the Leggett-Garg inequality because those two things are related. They have a similar name. And I think that Leggett-Garg inequality would have actually made the point that IP was trying to make better, although I still would have disagreed with it. So I don't think that was a scientific mistake. Nevertheless, I will accept that as that was my bad, that I misunderstood what he was saying there. I think that was the only thing that I was supposed to have done that was a scientific mistake. So I don't think I have made scientific errors. Actually, I probably have, right? I probably gotten something wrong, but I don't think IP's shown that here. Ultimately, I think his critique was riddled with problems and only makes me more confident in my idealistic worldview. Now, I was really disappointed in that last sentence, not so much because he thought it was riddled with problems, because, maybe it was, right? Although I don't think he really showed that apart from the one case that I mentioned. The idea that it makes him more confident in his worldview, though, is kind of disappointing, because that's like, I mean, why should anything I say make him more confident make IP more confident in his worldview? Like, how is this evidence in favor of his worldview? I don't really understand. Maybe he's going to say that, look, if the best that the smartest and most well-informed people can come up with is a really bad refutation, then that makes him more confident. I mean, I don't accept that I'm the best and the smartest people that can refute his arguments or show how there are problems with it. So I don't know whether there should be dramatic evidential value placed in the fact that whether he thinks I failed to do that. Maybe a little bit, perhaps, but anyway, I think that's maybe overstating my abilities there, because I wouldn't make any such claim. But anyway, so that's a little disappointing, just because that feels like a bit of confirmation bias there. In other words, if someone delivered a poor, error-riddled rebuttal of my arguments, such as the RHBS model that I've defended, I wouldn't become more confident in the model. I would just think that was a bad rebuttal. So I don't know. For some reason, that was disappointing to me. But oh no, I've clicked this again. I keep clicking things. Anyway, so we've finally gone through it here. I know it took longer than I thought, but well, that's the way it goes. Let me just give a quick summary. So, on the title, I stand by the title misrepresents, because it means misrepresent inaccurately or misleadingly. It doesn't imply that he's deliberately trying to, lie to people or anything like that. Holographic principle. IP equivocates on the holographic principle between a particular principle about 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions, or a cosmological models based on that. And he also fails to explain the nature of emergence when it comes to quantum mechanics, and misrepresents the way that the scientists are talking about this, often by taking popular talks or quotes from books and then presenting them as if you can sort of read metaphysical interpretations off those, which you can't. The paper that he gives to test the holographic principle does not provide evidence in favor of that particular model, or the cosmological model. he, I think, I fairly convincingly showed, does say and also imply in his videos that it does provide evidence for it. In fact, all it does is fail to falsify it. Emergence of Space and Time, the papers and quotes that he provides are not given proper context to explain what they mean or what they're referring to. I think he, like Sean Carroll, and this also Philosophy of Time, the Emergence of Time paper that he quotes here, are presented in a way where it's made to appear to support the metaphysical views that IP has, even though that they actually don't, and that he's drawing metaphysical implications that aren't present in the theories themselves. This paper here about philosophy of time does not show that time is emergent or provide any evidence for it, regardless of what wording you want to use for it. He tried to get around that by saying he just seemed to confirm it, but it doesn't matter how you word it. The video, I think, clearly gives an implication that we're supposed to think that it supported or provided evidence for the fact that time is emergent. It does no such thing. All it does is show a particular toy model of a mechanism that could be relevant to a theory of emergent time, which is interesting, but not at all what he was saying. Likewise, quotes from Fontini and others, I think, not given proper context and are presented in a misleading context. The reality of the wave function, I think that we didn't actually disagree too much here, because it turns out that all he was arguing is that instrumentalist views are purely instrumentalist views are not tenable, and therefore that if you accept a realist approach, then the wave function has to refer to something real. So that may be my misunderstanding of him. I do not have any further objection there. The paper about the world as virtual reality, I think, is complete garbage, and I don't think that IP should refer to it at all. And I don't think that his videos are very clear in presenting it as not being scientific, or like a scientific paper, or really theoretical or empirical in any way. But he's distancing himself from it here, and he doesn't want to read too much into it. So that's fine. I'm happy to that he's doing that. On the point of quantum cognition, I think that, although I'm happy to accept here that he did mention some more recent papers than the 2009 one I cited, I think that he does not, in his presentation of this literature, properly engage with or provide proper context for what these models are. The fact that the mere use of a formalism doesn't imply that there's any connection between the systems. And I gave examples from like equilibrium, chemical equilibrium, and economic equilibrium, and also the I think it was Poisson's equation and other mathematical theory formalisms that are applying in different contexts and doesn't mean that they're related. I don't think he gives that proper context there. I don't think he provides the context in the terms of explaining to the in his videos about what these models are doing, what aspects of quantum theory that they're applying, the fact that it seems that at least plausibly a lot of these phenomena, if not maybe all of them, could also be attained just by wave mechanics models, which is fundamentally what a lot of which is fundamentally the basis of a lot of quantum phenomena, and don't require necessarily any particular peculiarities of quantum mechanics. And I don't think the way it's presented in his videos makes it seem that there's just an application straightforwardly of these quantum models to the mind, which directly supports his idealist views, which I think that it does no such thing. And there's insufficient sort of clarifications and context there for the viewer to really understand that. The study about the neurons representing the cosmic web, I think, is presented very misleadingly, because the study does not show that there is any particular connection between the two. It only shows that if you visualize neurons in a particular part of the cortex at a particular zoom level with a particular stain, that the power spectrum of the two shows a rough correspondence. It's not clear. The viewer of the videos is not really given enough context to understand what that means, or how many degrees of freedom the researchers had in establishing that correspondence, or how many other systems would be plausibly show that correspondence if enough were tested. They only tested a few in the paper, which doesn't show that many others wouldn't also show that correspondence. So again, I think that it's implied and shown in a context where the viewer is encouraged to think that the science clearly supports the metaphysical interpretations that IP is placing on it, when in fact it does not, and the study has major problems that are not discussed by IP at all. And partly, I would say this is the fault of the paper, because the paper itself is really bad as well. It doesn't mention a number of these points. The Leggett inequality was, I think, basically, I ended up agreeing with him when I've understood that the Leggett inequality was not the Leggett-Garg inequality. And so all IP apparently was trying to claim is that you can't have local hidden variables, which is fine. So we'll move on from that. The Kochen-Specker theorem, or quantum contextuality, was a fairly controversial point. Again, I do not think that IP here, although I do struggle to understand exactly what he was claiming on the basis of it, I do think that he did not present enough context or clarity about what the theorem actually says. For example, that it's a formal result of quantum theory, that it can't be empirically tested. I think the way he presents quotes from physicists such as what was the guy's name again? Zellinger. No, that's not it. Well, whatever I can't find his name. Yeah, Anton Zellinger. Where what we see as a reality depends on our early decision what to measure. We're not passive observers. Those quotes that he presents and the way that they're incorporated in the video are misleading and imply a role for conscious observers, which is not in any way implied by the theory, nor supported by really anyone, as far as I know, who's publishing this literature here, and that. As a result, overall, Michael is failing to give enough of the background there and to present things in a clear way and to distinguish between his philosophical interpretations and what the theorem itself actually says. It's basically the same thing with the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment there, that he, I think, misstates some aspects of where the interference pattern is D0. And more importantly, he implies, or I think even states, that the delayed choice quantum eraser provides evidence for his preferred views of quantum mechanics in which there's a privileged place of observers, whereas in fact that although you can adopt that interpretation if one wishes, but there's no actual support provided by the experiment for that. So in conclusion, I stand by my claims that IP misrepresents the science, and the main problem is in lacking clarity about what he is claiming, lacking context or detail about, it doesn't have to be a lot of detail, but enough for the viewers to understand what he is actually appealing to and what the nature of the study is. And thirdly, a lack of a distinction between what the actual science shows and what his preferred philosophical interpretations are of that science. And I think a fourth one I would add is not giving enough of discussion about some of the critical limitations of at least some of the studies that he presents, such as the cosmic web one, which was really bad, or the comparison of the lambda CDM versus the quantum cosmology model is another one that had a lot of limitations that he didn't discuss. So those are some of the broad issues there that I think are the basis of why I say that he misrepresents the science. So hopefully you found this interesting. I realize it was longer than I had said. This always happens, so c'est la vie. But we did go through quite a lot. I'm hopeful that we can continue sort of discussing this, and I'm very open to discuss further with Michael personally if he wishes, although given what he said before, it probably isn't. And my main purpose here in making this video, just to summarize, is that I am very passionate about science and about philosophy, and I like to see both done well. What I don't like to see is scientific results being used to support conclusions that are derived from completely different basis, apparently, and then are sort of gerrymandered to fit in a very particular framework and presented as if they support that framework, whereas in fact they do not, and insufficient context and understanding has actually been given. So it's basically using science as as for support, not illumination, is a analogy that I've heard before. And yeah, I think that that's a real problem and discourages critical thinking and discourages good understanding of science and so forth. So that is one of the reasons why I take this so seriously. So that's all for me now. Thanks for listening, everyone. Talk to you another time. Bye.